Most people who know anything about the U-boat war picture the same thing. A wolf pack in the North Atlantic, grey water, a convoy, destroyers dropping depth charges while submarines scatter beneath the surface. That image is real, and it is well documented, but it captures only part of the war the German submarine fleet actually fights. There is another version of that war happening simultaneously on the other side of the world, in waters so far from the French Biscay ports where the boats depart that the round trip alone takes months. Ships hunting off the coast of Brazil, submarines operating in the waters around South Africa, boats reaching into the Indian Ocean approaches on patrols that keep their crews at sea for so long that the bread runs out before the first month ends, and the concept of a fixed daily routine erodes into something that patrol logs record but cannot fully describe. That distant version of the Atlantic War belongs to the Type 9. The difference between the Type 9 and its more famous smaller cousin, the Type 7, is not simply size. It is what size enables across thousands of miles of open ocean. A Type 9C displaces roughly 1,054 tons surfaced. It measures approximately 76 meters from bow to stern, about the length of a city block. It carries 22 torpedoes and enough diesel fuel to travel approximately 13,450 nautical miles on the surface without stopping. That range figure sounds abstract until you place it on a map and trace what it means in practice. A boat departing from Lorient on the French Atlantic coast can reach the waters off New York, conduct weeks of active operations, and return to France without requiring a single resupply stop in waters where no German supply infrastructure exists. This is why, when Dönitz plans Operation Drumbeat, the January 1942 assault on the American eastern seaboard, it is Type 9 boats that sail west, not the Type 7s that dominate the North Atlantic Wolfpack campaign. The 5 boats that open the operation include U-123, U-125, U-130, U-109, and U-66. They cross 3,000 nautical miles of open Atlantic, arrive off a coastline whose resort towns and city skylines are still fully illuminated, because America has not yet dimmed its lights for war, and they sink 25 ships, representing approximately 156,000 tons of Allied shipping in their first operational period. The boats return to France. The distance they have covered would take a Type 7 to its operational limits and back, with almost nothing left for the patrol itself. But the range story only makes sense if you understand what living inside that range costs the men doing it. 50-odd sailors occupy a hull 76 meters long for patrols that stretch toward 4 months in duration on the most distant operations. The personal space available to each man is roughly half a square meter of bunk, shared with the man on the previous watch, whose warmth is still in the mattress when the next crew member climbs in. The fresh food, bread, vegetables, sausages hung from the overhead pipes in the forward compartment, lasts perhaps 2 weeks before the diet narrows to canned goods and dried provisions that keep a man functional without ever making him feel well. By the 6th week, the bread has been moldy for a month. By the 8th week, the crew's faces have taken on the specific pallor that extended submarine service produces, a combination of artificial light, recycled air, and the physical compression of living in a space that does not permit real movement. And they are still weeks from home. The silence that surrounds a Type 9 operating in distant waters is its own kind of pressure. There are no Wolfpack companions to coordinate with, no adjacent boat whose sighting report might redirect the search. The commander makes every tactical decision alone, navigates his operational area using his own judgment, and manages his torpedo expenditure. 22 weapons that must last the entire patrol, with the arithmetic of a man who knows exactly what each one costs to replace, and how far away the replacement depot sits. One of the things that drew me into studying the Type 9's distant water operations specifically, rather than the better documented North Atlantic campaign, was the texture of those patrol logs from the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean patrols of 1942 and 43. Between attack entries, there are long stretches of navigational notation and weather observation that read almost meditatively. Days of open ocean where nothing happens except the boat moving through water and the crew maintaining systems and the sun rising and setting above a surface nobody inside can see. The war happening elsewhere on the planet is entirely absent from those passages. It is just the boat, the ocean, and the distance remaining. The South Atlantic operations that Type 9 boats conduct through 1942 concentrate on the shipping lanes converging off the West African coast near Freetown, a natural geographical choke point where convoy routes from South America, the Cape of Good Hope, and the North Atlantic approaches compress into a corridor that makes target finding considerably easier than the open ocean hunting the North Atlantic demands. A boat positioned in those waters encounters traffic that the escort system has not yet fully organized to protect, and the results in the early months reflect that vulnerability. Further east, Type 9 boats extend operations past the Cape of Good Hope into Indian Ocean approaches, where tankers carrying oil from Middle Eastern ports round the southern tip of Africa before heading north toward Britain. A tanker carrying crude oil measured in tens of thousands of tons represents a different category of target than a cargo vessel. The fuel it carries sustains aircraft, naval vessels, and the vehicles of armies fighting across 3 continents. And its loss cannot be replaced simply by building another ship to sail the same route. The same range advantage that makes these distant operations possible also makes them lonely in a specific way that the North Atlantic Wolfpack campaign, for all its dangers, is not. A boat operating off the South African coast in the middle of 1942 is roughly 9,000 miles from its home port. The nearest German naval asset of any kind is thousands of miles away. If the boat is damaged, a depth charge that fractures a fuel tank, a mechanical failure in the propulsion system, a torpedo malfunction that floods a tube, the crew addresses it with whatever tools and materials exist inside the hull, because no one is coming to help them. The engineering improvisation that submarine crews develop on extended patrols is not a celebrated feature of the historical accounts, but it is one of the operational realities that determines whether a boat completes a 4-month patrol or disappears in waters nobody is monitoring closely. The Allied anti-submarine response catches up with the distant water operations at a pace that tracks roughly 1 to 2 years behind the North Atlantic response, because the resources and the attention concentrate first where the threat is most acute. By 1943, the same progression of technologies that fractures the Type 7's operational environment in the North Atlantic begins extending outward. Shore-based patrol aircraft with centimetric radar extend their coverage from West African bases. Escort carriers, assigned to South Atlantic convoy protection, carry aircraft that operate in conditions no shore-based squadron can reach. The waters that once felt genuinely empty begin filling with the same detection architecture that has already eroded the Wolfpack campaign into strategic irrelevance north of the equator. The Type 9 adapts where it can and absorbs losses where it cannot. Schnorkel devices, eventually fitted to surviving boats, allow submerged diesel operation that reduces surface exposure, but the device limits speed and extends transit times in ways that compound the already significant distances the boats must cover between base and operational area. A snorkeling Type 9 crossing from Norway to a South Atlantic patrol zone is covering roughly 8,000 miles at speeds that make the transit itself a multi-week ordeal before the operational patrol even begins. 194 Type 9 boats are built across all variants during the war. Approximately 64% are lost. The men in those boats, roughly 50 per vessel, produce a human cost that the distant operations render even more invisibly than the North Atlantic campaign, because the waters where those boats sink are far from the convoy routes that generate survivor reports and post-action records. Some of those boats simply stop sending signals. The ocean keeps nothing. If you are settling in now, and the details of this are beginning to drift into the comfortable weight that comes when a long day is properly over, imagine a Type 9 somewhere between the Brazilian coast and West Africa, in the middle of a summer night in 1942. 12,000 miles from Berlin, 8,000 miles from the nearest friendly port. The diesel engines pushing the hull through dark water at a speed that will bring it to its patrol area in 3 more days. 50 men inside, most of them sleeping in rotation. One of them watching gauges in the engine room. One of them on the bridge watching the horizon. The horizon is empty. The ocean stretches in every direction, further than the eye can confirm. The war, at this specific moment, is entirely somewhere else. This is the entire history of the U-boat Type 9, the long-range raiders of the Atlantic during the Second World War. In the Dutch National Archives in The Hague, there is a memorandum typed in neat bureaucratic Dutch, stamped with a routine project number, referencing something called the Finnish Contract Variant. The date on that memo is 1932, 7 years before the Second World War formally began, and the unnamed future client described in that document, the one whose submarine designs are being quietly refined on Dutch drafting tables, inside a shell company staffed by German naval architects, is the German Kriegsmarine, a navy that was legally prohibited, under the terms of the Versailles Treaty, from having submarines at all. That is where the Type 9 begins. Not in a shipyard, not in a war, in a piece of paper designed to look like something else. The company was called the Ingenieurskantoor voor Scheepsbouw, the engineering office for shipbuilding, and it operated out of The Hague under Dutch commercial cover. What it actually was, to anyone who looked carefully, was a front for German submarine development. The engineers working there weren't Dutch hobbyists. They were German naval architects, carrying German technical priorities into a neutral jurisdiction, producing designs for a client who couldn't officially ask for them. The submarines they were nominally designing for Finland and Spain, the Finnish Veterinen class, the Spanish E1, were the legal disguise. The real product was the experience, the hull lines, the double hull architecture that would eventually become the Type 9. Now, I want to be precise about what the London Naval Treaty of 1935 actually permitted. It watered down, but didn't eliminate, the Versailles restrictions. And when Germany signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in June of that year, the British granted them a surface fleet up to 35% of Royal Navy tonnage, and quietly permitted a submarine force of up to 45%. The Foreign Office records present this as a diplomatic concession aimed at stabilizing a fragile European order. The German naval staff records, however, tell a different story, that the Anglo-German Naval Agreement was always understood, internally, as the activation trigger for a submarine expansion program that had been running, in design terms, since at least 1932. Both readings are supported by evidence. They cannot both be true in the same spirit. That contradiction matters. The keel of U-37, the first Type 9A, was laid down at the A.G. Weser shipyard in Bremen on the 15th of March, 1937. The hull dimensions that went into that yard's logbook were 76.5 meters overall length, pressure hull 58.75 meters, beam 6.51 meters. The boat had a displacement of 1,032 tons surfaced. 2 supercharged 9-cylinder MAN M9V 4046 diesel engines. 2 SSW electric motors for submerged propulsion. 6 torpedo tubes, 4 at the bow, 2 at the stern, capable of carrying 22 torpedoes in total, 12 of them internally and 10 more in external deck containers. The yard workers were told the boat was for extended patrol duties, which, in fairness, was accurate. The Finnish export connection wasn't just diplomatic cover, it had real engineering consequences. The Veterinen class used a double hull arrangement, a complete outer hull surrounding the structural pressure hull, and this was directly inherited by the Type 9. That outer hull wasn't armour. It housed ballast tanks, fuel bunkers, and those external torpedo canisters. It also meant the Type 9 had a wide, flat upper deck, which gave the crew room to work the external torpedo loading equipment. And it gave the boat a structural resilience that a single hull design simply didn't have. A depth charge near miss that might rupture a single hull submarine would be partially absorbed by the outer hull on a Type 9. This wasn't a wartime discovery. It was a pre-war design inheritance from boats built for Helsinki. U-37 entered service in August of 1938. Her first commanding officer was Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Schuch. The commissioning record is held at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, and it reads like every other commissioning record. Dry, official, unremarkable. What isn't in the commissioning record is the 13 months between keel laying and commissioning. 13 months during which Germany moved from nominal peacetime to the very edge of European war. During which Austria was absorbed, Czechoslovakia was dismembered, and the probability of a major European conflict moved from possible to near certain. The Type 9 production pipeline was running on wartime tempo before the war existed. U-39 was the third boat of the class. She lasted 13 days into her first operational patrol. On the 14th of September 1939, not yet 2 weeks after Britain entered the war, she fired torpedoes at HMS Ark Royal and missed. 3 British destroyers, HMS Faulkner, Firedrake and Foxhound, prosecuted a depth charge attack and forced her to the surface within 22 minutes. Her crew survived. Every man was taken prisoner. The British after-action report attributed the survival of Ark Royal partly to her evasive manoeuvre. The German BDU war diary attributed it entirely to a torpedo failure, specifically the magnetic pistol, which had failed to detonate on contact. Both accounts are probably correct. What's revealing is that the German record never acknowledges the evasion. The torpedo failure is more comfortable to document than the fact that the target got away. Of the original 8 Type 9A boats, U-37 through U-44, 6 were lost within the first 2 years of the war. 4 to enemy action, 2 to mines. That is a 75% loss rate in the founding cohort by 1941. This is not the story you'll find in most general histories, which tend to treat 1942 and 1943 as the dangerous years for U-boat crews. For the Type 9A, the dangerous years started in 1939. But U-37 survived, and what Schuch and his crew demonstrated on that boat's 11 war patrols, before she was withdrawn from combat service in March of 1941, was that the design concept was fundamentally sound. On her second patrol alone, U-37 sank 11 ships for 58,644 gross register tons. That figure, for a single patrol in the first year of the war, is extraordinary. By the time she was pulled from frontline operations, U-37 had sent 53 ships to the bottom, 200,124 gross register tons in total. She wasn't retired because she was worn out. She was retired because the Kriegsmarine realized that an experienced boat with an experienced crew was more valuable training the next generation than it was being risked on another patrol. That's a cold-blooded institutional calculation. It's also probably correct. The fall of France in June of 1940 changed the entire geometry of the Type 9's war. Before the fall of France, a Type 9 departing from Wilhelmshaven had to transit around the British Isles to reach the Atlantic, a journey that consumed roughly a third of its operational fuel before it had fired a single torpedo. After the fall of France, Lorient and Brest and Saint-Nazaire were German ports. The transit distance to the operational hunting grounds dropped by approximately 3,000 nautical miles per patrol. No redesign, no new engine, no extra fuel capacity, just the capture of a coastline. That single strategic accident, the rapid collapse of France in the summer of 1940, was arguably more consequential for Type 9 operational effectiveness than any technical modification ever made to the class. The Germans didn't plan for it. They simply exploited it with characteristic speed. The first thing I need to say about the second chapter of this story is that it is, by design, the most technically demanding part of the entire series. If you're the kind of listener who finds engineering specifications sleep-inducing, that's entirely understandable. But I'm going to ask you to stay with it, because the machine's interior logic shapes everything that follows. Every tactical decision, every crew nightmare, every patrol outcome. You cannot understand the Type 9's war without understanding what it actually was, mechanically. So, the pressure hull. It measured 58.75 meters in length and 4.40 meters in diameter. That is the steel tube in which 48 to 56 men ate, slept, worked, argued, and sometimes died for weeks at a time. The outer hull, the broader hydrodynamic structure visible from the outside, was not structural in the primary load-bearing sense. It was the housing for ballast tanks, fuel bunkers, and the external torpedo canisters. This double hull arrangement gave the Type 9 a specific structural advantage. The outer hull could be flooded partially, allowing the Leitender Ingenieur, the chief engineer, universally called the LI, to achieve precise trim control impossible on a single hull design. For a boat operating at the ranges the Type 9 was expected to reach, this trim flexibility was essential. You can't fine-tune your diving depth by guesswork when you're operating off the coast of West Africa with no support for 4,000 miles. The propulsion system consisted of two MAN M9V 4046 supercharged 9-cylinder diesel engines, producing a combined 4,400 PS, roughly 4,300 shaft horsepower. These drove two shafts directly via friction clutches at a surface speed of 18.2 knots. The engine room sat aft of the control room, separated by a pressure-tight bulkhead, and the noise at full power was approximately 110 decibels. Crew members within that compartment communicated entirely by hand signals after the first hour on watch. For submerged propulsion, two SSW double-acting electric motors, designated the 1GU 345-34, produced 1,000 PS combined, good for 7.7 knots. The useful submerged range was 78 nautical miles at 4 knots before the batteries were exhausted. 78 miles. That's roughly the distance from London to Birmingham. Submerged on a full charge. The battery system is where the story starts to get genuinely uncomfortable. The Type 9 carried two battery banks, 62 cells each, housed below the crew accommodation spaces. Charging those batteries while submerged produced hydrogen gas, not in trace amounts, in volumes that, at concentrations above 4% in a sealed pressure hull, were explosive. The LI's job included continuous monitoring of hydrogen concentration alongside CO2 levels, battery charge state, trim, depth, and about a dozen other variables simultaneously. This wasn't an emergency protocol. It was the routine working environment, every day, on every patrol, as long as the boat was submerged and needed to charge. Several crew memoirs describe the faint, sweet chemical smell that permeated the boat. That was battery off-gassing. They lived in it. The torpedo system is the part of the Type 9's design that most historians underplay. 22 torpedoes total. 12 internally stowed, 6 in their tubes plus 6 on racks, and 10 in external waterproof canisters on the deck. 3 canisters at the stern, 2 at the bow. Loading a torpedo from those external canisters into the boat was not a quick operation. A crane arrangement was used to lift the weapon over the deck. A cradle was rigged to guide it through the loading hatch, and the whole process, for a single torpedo, took 4 to 6 hours. The Naval Encyclopedia cross-references on this point are consistent, and U505's museum documentation confirms the loading equipment configuration. The BDU operational guidelines said this should only be done in calm sea conditions. The KTB records from U107 and U123 document loading in sea states of 4 and above, in darkness. The official guidance and the operational reality were routinely different things. There's a detail about those external canisters that the general histories usually skip past, and I think it's actually important. The canisters were not waterproof to crush depth. Below roughly 30 meters, water pressure would begin to seep into the casings. So after a crash dive to evade aircraft, which might take the boat to 100 meters or beyond, those external torpedoes had to be inspected, dried, and checked before they were reliably loadable. In a combat situation, immediately after a surprise air attack, with the boat back near the surface and potentially still being hunted, that inspection process could take 2 hours or more. During those 2 hours, the boat's effective torpedo complement was reduced to the 12 stored internally. That's a significant tactical limitation. Nobody seemed to discuss it very often in the operational literature, but it's right there in the equipment manuals. The G7 torpedo came in 2 fundamental versions, and choosing between them was one of the more consequential micro-decisions a Type 9 commander made on every attack run. The G7 Alpha was steam-powered, burning deck-aligned fuel in what the engineers called a wet heater combustion cycle. It ran at 40 knots over 7,500 meters. The problem? It left a visible white wake of exhaust bubbles. A target ship that spotted the wake had perhaps 30 to 45 seconds to attempt an evasion. The G7 Echo was electric, battery-driven, virtually silent, and leaving almost no trail. Its range was shorter, 5,000 meters at 30 knots, and its lead-acid batteries degraded in cold water, which reduced both its range and its reliability at North Atlantic temperatures. Cold water slows electrochemical reactions. A torpedo whose batteries were running below optimal temperature might not reach its target at all, or might detonate prematurely. The tactical calculation varied by geography. In the North Atlantic, the G7 Echo's invisibility made it preferable for most night surface attacks. In the tropical Indian Ocean, where battery temperature performance was adequate, the G7 Alpha's extra range and speed often outweighed the wake visibility penalty. This was not a choice made at headquarters. It was made by the commander, at periscope depth, 60 seconds before firing. The designed crush depth of the Type 9 was 200 meters. The operational depth, the depth commanders were supposed to stay within, was 100 meters. KTB entries from multiple boats document combat dives to 230 meters and beyond. At that depth, the pressure on the outer hull was approximately 23 atmospheres, 338 pounds per square inch. Hull groan was documented in several logs as alarming cracking sounds. At depth, the pressure hull would actually visibly compress. Sailors who had been aboard through multiple deep dives described watching the interior fittings shift slightly as the hull deformed under pressure and then recover as the boat rose. The boat was designed with considerable safety margin. Combat repeatedly tested exactly how much safety margin it actually had. The carbon dioxide problem deserves its own moment, because it was the least dramatic and perhaps the most operationally constraining of all the Type 9's submerged limitations. 56 men produce roughly 2.1 cubic meters of carbon dioxide per hour through respiration alone. The Kali cartridges, calcium hydroxide scrubbers, absorbed approximately 1.8 cubic meters per hour. That's a deficit of 0.3 cubic meters per hour under normal conditions. In prolonged submerged operations lasting more than 8 hours, CO2 concentrations would begin to rise measurably. Headaches came first, then impaired judgment, then, at concentrations above 5%, incapacitation. The LI planned submerged endurance against this physiological boundary, not primarily against battery capacity, as is commonly assumed, but against the crew's ability to function in a deteriorating atmospheric environment. The batteries might still have charge when the men could no longer think clearly enough to use them. At the end of all this engineering detail, what I keep returning to is the LI, the Leitender Ingenieur. He was responsible, simultaneously, for diesel engines, electric motors, battery banks, ballast tanks, trim, depth control, CO2 scrubbing, hydrogen monitoring, torpedo tube hydraulics, and the structural integrity of the pressure hull under combat stress. On a boat where the difference between a safe dive and a catastrophic one could be measured in seconds, the LI was the single officer who understood all the variables at once. The commanding officer made tactical decisions. The LI made the boat physically capable of surviving them. Several post-war accounts from surviving LIs describe the job as continuous crisis management at a level below the commander's awareness. The machine was always trying to kill its crew in several different ways simultaneously. The LI's job was to make sure it didn't. There is something about U-37's KTB entry for the 5th of September 1939 that has stayed with me since I first read through the sequence of early Type 9 operational logs. The entry for that date records her position as west of the Faroe Islands, proceeding to operational area. The notation covers course, speed, fuel state, sea state, atmospheric pressure, not a word more. The war has been underway for 4 days. The entry reads like a log from a mail steamer. That clinical absence is, in its own way, the opening of the operational story. The 8 Type 9A boats, U-37 through U-44, entered service between August 1938 and early 1939. Not all of them survived to fire a successful torpedo in anger. U-39, as we've noted, lasted 13 days into the war. U-40 struck mines in the English Channel in October of 1939 without sinking a single ship. U-41 went down to HMS Antelope off the Irish coast in February of 1940, having sunk 5 vessels, 22,815 gross register tons. U-42 made 2 patrols, damaged 1 ship, and was sunk by HMS Imogen and Ilex before the autumn of '39 was out. U-44 sank 8 ships, 30,885 gross registered tons, and then struck a mine off the Dutch coast in March of 1940. 6 of 8, gone inside 2 years. And yet the class wasn't a failure because the boats that survived demonstrated something that the Kriegsmarine had theorized but not yet proved. That a submarine of sufficient range could operate independently across the western approaches and far out into the Atlantic, without base support, for weeks at a time, and do serious damage to Allied merchant shipping in the process. Heinrich Schuck on U-37 was the clearest demonstration of this. His second patrol produced 11 ships sunk. His operational pattern was methodical: long transits at economical surface speed, attacks on lone merchantmen at night, detailed logging of fuel consumption and torpedo expenditure at every stage. The KTB doesn't editorialize. Schuck's logs don't contain reflections on what he's doing or why. They contain positions, headings, tonnages, weather states. What they reveal, between the lines, is a commander who was gradually learning the dimensions of his operational radius, how far he could go, how long he could stay, how much fuel he needed to hold in reserve for the return. This learning process was itself an intelligence product. Every successful patrol taught the Kriegsmarine something specific about what the Type 9 could actually do in practice, as opposed to what the engineering specifications said it should be able to do. The fall of France in June of 1940 was the event that transformed this learning from useful to decisive. Before France fell, Lorient was a French port. After France fell, it was a U-boat base. The Atlantic Wall hadn't been built. The bunkers hadn't been constructed yet. But the port facilities were immediately functional, and German engineers began adapting them for submarine operations with remarkable speed. What the capture of the French Atlantic coast gave the Type 9 was not more fuel capacity, not a better engine, not a longer hull. It gave the boat roughly 3,000 additional nautical miles of operational radius, simply by eliminating the transit around the British Isles. Every patrol now began with the boat already in the Atlantic. Every return ended in France rather than Germany. The economics of the long-range submarine changed overnight. The magnetic torpedo pistol failure is a thread that runs through the entire early operational period, and it has a specific technical explanation that most accounts underplay. The Pi 1 detonator, the magnetic pistol fitted to the G7 Alpha torpedo, was calibrated during development for the magnetic anomaly of the Earth's field in the North Sea. The Earth's magnetic field is not uniform. It varies by latitude and by local geology. In the Atlantic, particularly as boats moved south and west toward the Azores and the Canary Islands, the magnetic field characteristics diverged from the values the detonator was designed for. The torpedo would pass beneath a target at the correct depth. The magnetic field of the target hull would trigger the detonator, but the detonation would occur at the wrong point in the fuse sequence, either too early or not at all. This was understood within roughly 6 weeks of the war's beginning by engineers at the Torpedo Inspectorate. It was not officially acknowledged as a systemic fault until April of 1940. In the intervening months, U-boat commanders were filing frustrated reports about torpedoes that ran correctly and simply didn't detonate. U-39's failure against Ark Royal was almost certainly one such case. The institutional decision to suppress, or at minimum delay, the public acknowledgement of the Pi 1 failure is one of those genuinely uncomfortable bureaucratic moments that war histories tend to gloss over. The Torpedo Inspectorate had a professional and institutional interest in not having its primary product declared defective. The BDU had an interest in not having the combat effectiveness of its primary weapon questioned during the opening weeks of a campaign. The crews in the boats had an interest in knowing that their weapons worked. These three interests were not aligned. The crew's interest lost. For several months, men were risking their lives on attacks that had a known but unacknowledged probability of producing a dud. What Shook's patrols on U-37 established, beyond the tactical specifics, was that the Type 9 was a category of weapon genuinely different from anything the Royal Navy was fully prepared to counter at that stage of the war. It was faster than a destroyer could sustain at range. It could operate at distances that made air patrol coverage marginal. It could carry enough torpedoes to conduct multiple attacks across weeks of operation without returning to base. And it could, crucially, choose when and where to fight. The initiative, in the early years, was almost entirely with the submarine commander. He decided when to attack. He decided when to evade. He decided when to surface. The escort commander could only react to an attack that had already happened, from a position that was already past. It was U-37's 11 patrols, and the accumulating evidence from U-38 and U-43, the other survivors of the I-10A cohort, that convinced the Kriegsmarine leadership that the Type 9 program was worth accelerating and expanding. The I-10B variant was already in planning. The I-10C was being discussed. The logic of the design, more range, more torpedoes, same basic hull architecture, was being validated patrol by patrol loss by loss, tonnage by tonnage. When U-37 was finally withdrawn from frontline service in March of 1941, she had outlived 6 of her sisters and accumulated a kill record that made her the 6th most successful U-boat of the entire war by that point. She was sent to train new crews. The Kriegsmarine was getting ready to build a lot more Type 9 submarines, and they needed experienced men to crew them. 22 ships, 100,000 gross register tons, a single patrol, 1 boat. Gunther Hessler's 5th patrol on U-107, conducted between May and October of 1941, has a specific place in the historical record that even people familiar with the U-boat war sometimes don't fully appreciate. The actual figure, the definitive post-war verified total for that patrol, was 86,699 gross registered tons across 14 ships. That is the highest tonnage total for any single submarine patrol by any boat of any nation in any theatre in the entire Second World War. The second highest figure, for comparison, was something over 50,000 gross registered tonnage. The gap between first and second place is larger than the second place total. Hessler wasn't just the record holder, he was in a different category entirely. The Type 9B that made this possible was, in dimensional terms, almost identical to the IXA. The hull was the same length, the armament was identical, the propulsion system was unchanged. The improvement was 11 metric tons of additional fuel bunkerage. 11 tons. That took the surface range from 10,500 nautical miles to 12,000. And those extra 1,500 miles were the reason U-107 could reach the waters off Freetown, Sierra Leone, and stay there for weeks rather than days. Freetown in 1941 was the key to the West African shipping route. The convoys running from Britain to West Africa and from West Africa toward the South Atlantic and beyond were not yet comprehensively escorted. The Royal Navy was stretched, desperately, genuinely stretched, across the North Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the waters around the British Isles. The Freetown approaches were a gap, not an oversight exactly, but a resource prioritization that reflected brutal wartime arithmetic. You protect the most important routes first, and you protect the others when you have the capacity. In 1941, the Royal Navy didn't have the capacity. Ships were sailing independently in the Freetown approaches, and Hessler found them. His operational pattern, as reconstructed from the KTB, was surface attacks at night. The Type 9B's surface profile was relatively low. At night, against a large merchant ship silhouetted against whatever ambient light existed, the submarine was difficult to spot until it was already close. The boat's surface speed of 18 knots allowed Hessler to close on targets or reposition between attacks with a rapidity that no surface vessel of the period could match at that range. He was operating 4,000 miles from the nearest German-controlled port. He had no air cover, no surface escort support, no possibility of reinforcement if something went wrong. And he was hunting with the systematic patience of someone who understood that the mathematics of the situation were entirely in his favor. 112 days at sea, 14 ships. The patrol ran from late May to early October. By the time U-107 returned to Lorient, Hessler had fired through the majority of his 22 torpedo load and spent the remaining operational time using his deck gun against smaller targets. Karl Dönitz was personally on the dock when U-107 came in. Hessler was his son-in-law. I should address that biographical fact directly, because to ignore it would be intellectually dishonest. Hessler was married to Dönitz's daughter. The assignment to the Freetown area, which turned out to be the most productive patrol assignment in the history of submarine warfare, was made by the BDU, which was commanded by Dönitz. German naval analysis published after the war presents the Freetown deployment as a purely strategic decision based on identified gaps in Allied convoy coverage, applied to the boat with the range to exploit those gaps. British intelligence assessments from the same period suggest that the pattern of Type 9 deployments to the Freetown area was part of a coordinated BDU strategy, not a series of individual commander initiatives. Both interpretations have evidential support. Whether Hessler's specific assignment was influenced by family connection or purely by the logical match between his boat's capabilities and the operational gap is a question the archives don't definitively resolve. What I can say with confidence is this: the record stands regardless of the assignment's origin. 86,699 gross registered tons in one patrol. And the structural reason it was possible, the 11 extra tons of fuel in the Type 9B's bunkerage, is a reminder that in submarine warfare, as in many forms of complex engineering, marginal improvements in the right capability can produce non-marginal results in the field. Hessler survived the war. He worked for the British Admiralty after 1945 as a consultant on submarine tactics. He co-authored, with former enemies, the official British naval history of the U-boat campaign in the Atlantic. The man responsible for the war's most lethal single submarine patrol spent a decade helping Britain write the definitive account of that same war. The British found him too useful to prosecute. There is something in that post-war arrangement that says quite a lot about how seriously both sides took the practical knowledge these men carried. The Type 9B's operational record more broadly is instructive precisely because it came during the period before Allied anti-submarine technology and doctrine caught up with the threat. The boats of this subclass, U-103, U-107, U-108, U-123, U-124, produced kill rates per patrol that were higher, on average, than any subsequent Type 9 variant operated. The 9B was the right technology, deployed at the right moment, against an adversary that hadn't yet developed the means to counter it. Hessler's record isn't just a number, it's a measurement of that window of relative impunity. By 1943, that window was closing. But in the summer of 1941, standing on the dock at Lorient, counting 14 ships in one patrol, it must have seemed very wide indeed. The strategic implication wasn't lost on anyone in the BDU operations room. If a single Type 9B could do this off Freetown, what could 5 of them do off the American coast after the United States entered the war? That question was already being considered in late 1941, even before Pearl Harbor. When the answer was attempted, in January of 1942, it would produce consequences that nobody on the American side was remotely prepared for. There is a line in Reinhard Hardigan's account of his January 1942 patrol off the American coast that has become something of a famous quotation in the historiography of the Atlantic War. He described looking toward the shore from his conning tower at night and being unable to understand. The word he used in his memoir was understand. Why the Americans were so generous with their lights. The city glow was visible from the sea. Ships were sailing independently, their silhouettes backlit against it. There was no blackout. There was barely any coordinated response at all. 5 boats. The original Drumbeat wave consisted of 5 Type 9B submarines. Dönitz had wanted 12. The Naval High Command had redirected boats to the Mediterranean and to the coast of Norway, believing those theatres required reinforcement before an Atlantic coast campaign could be mounted. So Dönitz got 5, U-1, 2, 3, under Reinhard Hardigan, U-66, under Richard Zapp, U-109, under Heinrich Bleichrodt, U-125, under Ulrich Volkers, and U-130, under Ernst Kals. They departed between the 18th and the 25th of December, 1941, with orders to begin simultaneous operations on the American eastern seaboard on the 13th of January 1942. That date coordination was itself a tactical choice. Simultaneous attacks across a wide front would maximize confusion and prevent rapid defensive concentration. The transit from Lorient to the American coast was approximately 3,000 nautical miles, a journey the Type 9B could manage at 10 knots surface speed in roughly 12 to 13 days, consuming something in the region of 35% of its total fuel capacity. That left 65% for operations on station and the return journey. The fuel budget required discipline, every sprint to close on a target, every evasive maneuver, every hour of above economical speed running was a deduction from that remaining reserve. Hardigan's KTB shows explicit fuel versus speed trade-off calculations at least 7 separate times during the January patrol. These weren't improvised decisions. They were the product of a navigating officer and commanding officer working the numbers in real time on every tactical choice. The KTB entry for U-123 on the 12th of January 1942 records the first Drumbeat kill. A Canadian freighter struck off Nova Scotia. The ship was sailing with its navigation lights on. The lights were on. In the Eastern Sea Frontier Command War Diary, the American operational record for the same period, held in National Archives RG-38, the entry for that week records discussions about coastal blackout procedures. The decision to implement blackout was deferred on grounds of disruption to civilian commerce. Hardigan's KTB for the same week records 5 successful attacks on illuminated targets. These two documents are describing the same 3 days. One is a bureaucratic deferral. The other is a body count. The tankers were the strategic objective. Not the freighters, not the passenger vessels, the tankers. A loaded tanker represented not just cargo tonnage, but fuel supply, and the fuel coming up the American coast from Texas refineries and down through the Caribbean from Venezuela was the logistical lifeblood of the Allied war effort in the Atlantic and, increasingly, in North Africa. When Hardigan's boat found the tanker Nornus off Cape Hatteras in the early hours of the 19th of January, past midnight at 0040 hours, and put 2 torpedoes into her, 9,577 gross registered tons of tanker and its cargo ceased to be available to the Allied war effort. The KTB notation was brief. The oil burning on the water was visible for hours. By the 6th of February, when the 5 original Drumbeat boats headed back toward Lorient, they had collectively sunk 25 ships for 156,939 gross register tons. Not a single U-boat had been lost. The exchange rate, Allied tonnage destroyed per boat deployed, was the highest of any coordinated U-boat operation in the entire Atlantic campaign. And this was before the extended campaign that followed through the spring and into the summer of 1942, as more boats cycled through the American and Caribbean theatre, and the total losses climbed toward 3 million gross register tons in American-controlled waters by July. The Eastern Sea frontier records are genuinely difficult to read alongside the KTBs. What the American documents reveal, and they're not trying to conceal this, they're simply contemporaneous records, is an institution reacting to a situation it hadn't anticipated, hadn't prepared for, and couldn't initially process. There were discussions of convoy systems as early as January. There were recommendations from the British, who had been running Atlantic convoys for 2 years, and had learned in blood what worked. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of United States Fleet, was not receptive to those recommendations. The official explanation was insufficient escort vessels. Post-war analysis of the records suggests King was also resistant to accepting British tactical advice in a context where such acceptance might imply American unpreparedness. The tonnage lost between January and May of 1942 before a proper convoy system was finally implemented on the American coast, represents the price of that resistance. When the coastal convoy system was finally introduced in May of 1942, the kills along the eastern seaboard dropped almost immediately. Which means the solution was available and had been demonstrated as effective for the 18 months the British had been running it. The delay was institutional, not technical. The U-boats didn't stop coming. They simply shifted south into the Caribbean, where the convoy system hadn't been extended yet. The total losses in the Caribbean in June and July of 1942 were higher than the eastern seaboard losses in January and February. The convoy system moved the killing zone before it ended it. I find myself, when reading through the comparative primary records from this period, the German KTBs alongside the American and British operational documents, struck less by the tactical drama than by the sheer administrative gap between what was known and what was done about it. The British were recommending coastal convoys before Drumbeat began. The solution to the magnetic torpedo pistol failure was known 6 weeks into the war and suppressed for months. The Germans knew they'd be sailing into an undefended coast. The Americans knew the coast was undefended and chose institutional comfort over preventive action. The war at sea in 1942 was not just a contest of hardware. It was a contest of institutional competence, and for those specific months, Germany was winning it. There was no official record of how many men were crying in the torpedo room. That detail comes from a personal diary, one of the documents captured aboard U-505 in June of 1944, and now held at the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington. The diary's author is unidentified by name in the archival record. His entry describes a depth charge attack at some unspecified point during a patrol. The lights going out, the sounds, the counting. He wrote that he could hear someone crying steadily in the torpedo room. Not loudly, just steadily. And that the light-ender ingenieur was counting charges. He got to 30 before he stopped counting. That document is the opening of a very different part of this story. The Type 9 was built for 56 men. Its pressure hull, 58.75 meters of steel, 4.40 meters. That slightly sweet chemical note from the battery banks. Hydrogen and organic compounds off-gassing through the ventilation as naturally as breath. You couldn't scrub it out. It was in the metalwork. Men who served on Type 9 boats and survived the war have described, in interviews taken decades later, catching that specific combination of smells in machine rooms and workshops and having an immediate physical reaction. Not nostalgia exactly, but something more visceral and less comfortable. The food problem had a precise timeline. A Type 9 on a 70-day patrol departed with approximately 4.5 tons of provisions. For the first 2 weeks, the diet was relatively good. Fresh bread, eggs, occasional fresh meat, tinned vegetables. After the 3rd week, the bread was exhausted, and the transition to purely preserved rations began. By the 5th or 6th week, mold was a routine condition of whatever bread remained, and the standard response was to eat it anyway. Weight loss of 5 to 8 kilograms per patrol was documented by Kriegsmarine medical officers as within the normal range for submarine crews on extended patrols. That phrase, within the normal range, appeared in official medical reports as though it were a meteorological observation. The documented CO2 figures matter here in a very human way. 56 men produce roughly 2.1 cubic meters of carbon dioxide per hour through respiration alone. The Kali scrubbers absorbed approximately 1.8 cubic meters. The deficit, 0.3 cubic meters per hour, accumulated during extended submerged periods. The headaches came first, described in crew accounts as a specific kind of pressure behind the eyes, different from fatigue. Then judgment became subtly impaired, not dramatically, not in a way that was immediately obvious, but in ways that experienced submariners noticed and commented on in their log entries. The LI tracked CO2 concentrations as a primary operational variable. In his calculations, the question was always, how long before the men can't function well enough to safely operate the boat? Not how long until the batteries die. How long until the crew becomes a liability? Wolfgang Luth wrote an internal memo in 1943 that circulated within the Kriegsmarine but was never formally adopted as standard doctrine. It was titled something approximating Problems of Leadership on a Submarine, and it is one of the more extraordinary documents produced by any military officer during the Second World War, because it takes seriously the question that the institution largely preferred to ignore. What does extended isolation in extreme physical conditions, under the sustained possibility of violent death, do to the human beings involved? Luth's answers included structured social activities, organized competitions, education sessions, careful individual recognition, deliberate maintenance of routines that gave the crew a sense of forward time. He wasn't theorizing abstractly. He was commanding one of the longest patrols in submarine history at the time he wrote it, and he was observing what happened to men around him and trying to respond to it with intention. The Kriegsmarine's official response to Luth's memo was to circulate it without implementing it, which is to say, the institution read a thoughtful, specific, experientially grounded set of recommendations for crew psychological support on extended patrols, and filed them. Leave was the standard provision. Crews returned from 70-day patrols, took 2 or 3 weeks of leave, and were expected to be operationally ready again. Kriegsmarine medical records from 1942 and 1943 document recurring patterns in returning crews. Significant weight loss, disrupted sleep cycles persisting 2 to 3 weeks post-return, heightened startle responses, and what the medical language of the period called vegetative nervous disturbances. In the medical language of today, those are recognizable as acute stress reactions. The institution had no treatment protocol for them. Men went back. The depth charge experience is described in crew memoirs with a consistency of specific physical detail that makes those accounts unusually credible. The first charge would be distant, felt more than heard, a concussion through the hull rather than a sound. Close charges lifted men off their feet. The lights failed. Interior condensation rained from the hull in the pressure differential. The boat's depth shifted involuntarily. The sounds of hull stress at depth, those cracking, groaning noises that the hull made as pressure deformed it, were audible and ongoing, and every man aboard knew they were listening to their only protection between themselves and the sea. The LI would be working at his instruments, calculating how much more depth the hull could safely take, how much battery remained for maneuver, how long the CO2 levels would stay within functional range. The post-war medical literature on submarine crew psychological outcomes is thin for the German side, partly because so many men didn't survive to be assessed, and partly because the Kriegsmarine wasn't structured to produce it. What we have are fragments: the medical reports, the crew memoirs, the personal diaries recovered from captured and sunk boats. They tell a consistent story. The Type 9's operational requirements were extraordinary by any comparative measure. Men went on extended patrols, experienced sustained mortal threat, lived in conditions of chronic physical deprivation, and came back and went again. The institutional expectation was that this was what submariners did. The question of what it cost them, in ways that didn't show up on a medical chart, was left largely to individual commanders like Luth to notice and try to address on their own authority. The bread locker on U505 still has its mold chart. That detail is in the museum conservation documentation. 80-odd years after the boat was captured, the chart that the provisioning crew used to track the rate of deterioration of the bread supply is still there, because nobody removed it and the conservation team preserved everything they found. It's a 2-inch piece of institutional planning in a steel box. I don't have a scholarly point to make about it. It just strikes me, every time I look at the museum records, as the most specific possible way to understand what it actually meant to provision a submarine for a 70-day patrol. Somebody had to plan for the bread going mouldy. Somebody made that chart. It was part of the job. On the 12th of September 1942, at 22 minutes past 10 in the evening, a U-boat torpedo found the British passenger cargo liner Laconia in the South Atlantic, approximately 250 nautical miles northeast of Ascension Island. The Laconia weighed 19,695 tons. She went down carrying a crew, soldiers, civilian passengers, and, in her lower decks, approximately 1,800 Italian prisoners of war. Italy was, at this point in the war, a German ally. The commanding officer of the submarine that fired the torpedo was Korvettenkapitan Werner Hartenstein, aboard U-156, a Type 9C. His KTB entry for the moment of attack is factual and operational. When the Laconia went under and the survivors entered the water, the men calling out for help, the men calling out in Italian, were, technically, Hartenstein's nation's allies drowning. What Hartenstein did next has been argued about for 80 years. He surfaced. He began pulling survivors from the water. He took 193 people aboard a boat designed for 57. And then, in the decision that has made his name a permanent footnote in the laws of naval warfare, he broadcast a message in plain, unencrypted language to any Allied vessel within receiving range, offering safe passage to anyone coming to assist the survivors in the water. He identified himself. He identified his boat. He draped a Red Cross flag over his conning tower. 3 other submarines were ordered to assist: U-506, U-507, and the Italian Capellini. For several days, the Type 9s maneuvered through wreckage and lifeboats in the South Atlantic, pulling people out, transferring them to anything that would hold them, waiting for the French vessels that Hartenstein had contacted to arrive. The British Ultra intercepts at Bletchley Park picked up Hartenstein's unencrypted broadcast immediately. His position was now known. His patrol area was updated in the intelligence picture. His boat designation was confirmed. By transmitting in plain language, by prioritizing the rescue over operational security, Hartenstein had told the Allies not just where he was, but that he was there. A single humanitarian decision produced signals intelligence consequences that lasted weeks. On the 16th of September, an American B-24 Liberator from Ascension Island arrived over the scene. The aircraft's crew could see the Red Cross flag on U-156's conning tower. They could see the lifeboats in tow. The aircraft attacked anyway. The after-mission report, reviewed decades later, states that the crew observed the submarine towing lifeboats. The orders were to destroy all submarines on site. Hartenstein was forced to dive, releasing the survivors in the water back to whatever fate awaited them. The French vessels arrived later and collected those who remained. The German internal communications log for the days following the attack documents Dönitz's response in real time. The BDU War Diary entry for the 17th of September 1942 carries what became known as the Laconia Order, Operational Order 154. The language of the order, which was later entered into evidence at Nuremberg as document D630, states that all attempts to rescue members of sunk ships, including fishing out swimmers and putting them in lifeboats, righting capsized lifeboats, or handing out provisions, were to cease. The justification given was that rescue contradicted the requirements of the war for the destruction of enemy ships and their crews. The order was the central prosecution exhibit against Dönitz at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. And yet, Dönitz was not convicted on the submarine warfare charge alone. The reason he wasn't, or at least one of the reasons, is that the American Admiral Chester Nimitz submitted an affidavit to the tribunal stating that United States submarine forces in the Pacific had conducted unrestricted submarine warfare against Japanese shipping from the first day of America's entry into the war, including the deliberate non-rescue of survivors. The Allied court had to acknowledge that the practice Dönitz was being prosecuted for was one that Allied forces had themselves followed. Dönitz received a 10-year sentence. He was released in 1956. He died in 1980. I've read the Laconia order many times, and I want to be careful not to resolve it too neatly in either direction. It was, on one reading, a direct military response to an operation that ended with a German submarine being attacked while flying a Red Cross flag over lifeboats. On another reading, it was the codification of a policy that treated enemy merchant sailors as legitimate targets for deliberate abandonment after their ships were destroyed. Both readings are present in the document simultaneously. The Nuremberg Tribunal's difficulty in convicting Dönitz specifically on this charge reflects the same ambiguity that I feel reading it. The Nimitz affidavit didn't exonerate anyone. It established that the standards of warfare actually being practiced by both sides diverge significantly from the standards being legally argued about. What the Laconia incident reveals, in addition to all of its legal and moral dimensions, is something about the specific character of the Type 9C's extended operating theatre. Hartenstein was in the South Atlantic, 250 miles from Ascension Island, thousands of miles from any German-controlled port, operating entirely on his own initiative and judgment. There was no rapid communications loop with BDU that could resolve the situation in real time. He made a series of decisions, to rescue, to broadcast, to fly the Red Cross flag, based on his own assessment of what the situation required. His superior, thousands of miles away in a command bunker, had to respond to what Hartenstein had already done, not to what he'd been ordered to do. The Type 9's long-range operational character created, by structural necessity, a degree of commanding officer autonomy that would have been inconceivable in a shorter-range vessel. And that autonomy, in September of 1942, produced the most morally complicated episode in the entire Atlantic campaign. The total dead in the Laconia sinking, between 1,658 and 1,757, depending on which contemporary count you use. The majority of those were the Italian prisoners of war in the lower decks, trapped below the waterline as the ship went down. Allied allies of Germany, killed by a German torpedo, in a sinking that produced the German naval order most frequently cited in post-war legal discussions of the laws of armed conflict at sea. The arithmetic of that sequence is genuinely difficult to sit with. There is a scheduling document in the German naval records that doesn't look like much at first glance. It's a logistics table from the BDU War Diary, dated April of 1942, and it consists of grid reference coordinates, submarine hull numbers, estimated rendezvous dates, and fuel transfer volumes required. 12 Type 9 operational boats. 4 or 5 rendezvous points scattered across the Mid-Atlantic and South Atlantic. 1 supply submarine, U-459, a Type 14, threading between all of them like a postman on an impossible route. That single page of bureaucratic scheduling was, in operational terms, the backbone of Germany's entire global submarine strategy. Without the Type 14, the Type 9's long-range reach was genuine but bounded. A Type 9C departing Lorient with full tanks had a theoretical operational radius of roughly 4,500 nautical miles. Enough to reach the Caribbean, barely, or the northern approaches to the South Atlantic, and return. The Caribbean campaign of 1942 was at the very edge of what was sustainably possible without refueling. Add a single mid-ocean rendezvous with a Type 14, and that radius expanded to approximately 7,500 nautical miles. Cape Town became reachable. Freetown became comfortable. The Gulf of Mexico became routine. The Milchkuh, the milk cow, which is what the crews called them, was not a logistical convenience. It was the mechanism by which the Type 9 became a genuinely global weapon. The Type 14 was derived from the Type 7 hull, but extensively modified. It sacrificed all torpedo armament, no tubes, no offensive capability whatsoever, to carry additional fuel and provisions. A fully loaded Type 14 carried approximately 432 tons of transferable diesel fuel, plus spare torpedoes, food supplies, medical equipment, and replacement parts. At sea, it could service 4 or 5 operational Type 9 boats on a single patrol, depending on their individual fuel states and provisioning needs. The fuel transfer process was conducted on the surface, typically at night, using a floating hose passed between the two submarines, running close parallel courses. Transfer rates were approximately 15 to 20 tons per hour, which meant a full resupply of an 80 to 100 ton fuel deficit took 5 or 6 hours. 5 or 6 hours on the surface, 2 submarines running side by side. Stationary, essentially, in whatever sea state the Atlantic provided. The vulnerability of that arrangement is obvious in retrospect. What's less obvious, and what the German naval records show they genuinely didn't understand at the time, is the specific mechanism by which the Allies were locating the rendezvous positions. The BDU coordinated the Milchkuh meetings by radio, using the naval Enigma cipher. The positions, the dates, the hull numbers, all encrypted, all transmitted, all decoded at Bletchley Park in near real time by late 1942. The RAF Coastal Command aircraft that started appearing over Milchkuh rendezvous coordinates in 1943 weren't there because of luck or intensified patrol schedules. They were there because someone in Britain had read the meeting invitation. The Germans knew something had changed. The evidence was in the loss rate, which started climbing for the Type 14 fleet from the spring of 1943. Between June and September of that year, 7 of the 10 operational Type 14 boats were sunk. 7 out of 10. The German response was the wrong answer to the right question. They suspected their radio transmissions were being direction found, so they imposed tighter radio silence protocols. Radio silence didn't solve anything, because the intercepts weren't of the signal's location, but of its content. The coordinates in the messages, not the bearing of the transmitter, were the problem. Boats kept arriving at positions they had encrypted, and the Allies kept being there. The centimetric radar was the other half of this equation, and it operated on a wavelength the Germans couldn't detect. The Allied ASV Mark III, Airborne Surface Vessel Radar, fitted to Coastal Command aircraft from early 1943, operated at 9.7 GHz, a wavelength of roughly 3 centimeters. German submarine radar detectors, the METOX receivers deployed through 1942, were tuned to the 1.2 to 1.6 GHz range. The METOX was perfectly capable of detecting the old British radar. It was completely deaf to the new one. U-boat crews equipped with METOX receivers were receiving no warning from their detection equipment and concluding they weren't being tracked. They were wrong. Aircraft equipped with ASV Mark III could detect a surface submarine at 15 to 20 nautical miles, well beyond visual range, well beyond the horizon, in complete darkness. The submarine that thought it was invisible was, in fact, lit up on a radar screen 15 miles away. The German technical intelligence community had, in fact, identified the probability of Allied centimetric radar as early as February of 1943. The evidence came from wreckage analysis of shot-down British aircraft. The report was submitted to Naval High Command. It was not acted upon with the urgency the situation required. By May of that same year, 41 U-boats were lost in a single month. The institutions that should have translated the intelligence into an engineering response, new radar detectors tuned to the centimetric wavelength, accelerated deployment, urgent modification schedules, moved at peacetime bureaucratic speed through a wartime crisis. There is a recurring pattern here that I find genuinely frustrating in the records. The gap between knowing and doing, between intelligence acquired and intelligence applied. The Germans weren't ignorant of the threat. They were institutionally too slow to respond to what they knew. U-490 was the last operational Type 14. She was at sea for 40 days in late spring of 1944, without completing a single successful fuel transfer. Every scheduled rendezvous had been preemptively disrupted, not by chance patrol contact, but by directed interception based on decoded communications. She was sunk on the 11th of June, 1944, by 2 American destroyer escorts. Her loss ended the Milchkuh program entirely. From that date forward, any Type 9 that ran low on fuel in a distant ocean was on its own. No resupply, no extension, no margin. The boats kept going out, but they were going shorter distances, staying for shorter times, achieving less. The logistics infrastructure that had made the Type 9 a global weapon had been surgically removed. The strategic consequence mapped directly onto BDU operational statistics for the second half of 1943. Type 9 patrol areas contracted. The Indian Ocean operations continued, but only because the Type 9D variant had sufficient built-in range to manage the transit independently. The Caribbean became more difficult. West Africa became harder to sustain. The boats weren't worse. The hulls, the crews, the commanders were broadly the same. But the enabling infrastructure was gone, and without the Milchkuh, the geography of what was possible shrank to what the fuel tanks could support without external help. The thing about the Milchkuh story that I keep returning to is its essential fragility. The entire extended operational reach of the Type 9 program, the patrols to Freetown, the Caribbean campaign, the Indian Ocean operations, rested on a fleet of 10 unarmed supply submarines, coordinated by radio signals that an adversary was reading, meeting at positions that adversary was transmitting to its aircraft. It was a magnificent operational concept, resting on an intelligence foundation that was structurally compromised from almost the moment it became operationally important. The Type 9 could reach anywhere. The Milchkuh that enabled that reach couldn't survive the signals environment of 1943. By the early autumn of 1943, the most productive routes from Lorient to the Indian Ocean ran directly through what RAF Coastal Command had transformed into something resembling an armed corridor. The Bay of Biscay, the body of water that separates the French Atlantic coast from the Spanish coast and opens into the broad Atlantic beyond, had always been a transit zone for U-boats departing and returning to the French bases. In the early years of the war, this transit was dangerous, but manageable. Aircraft coverage was limited, coordination was imperfect, and a submarine running on the surface at night could cross the bay with reasonable confidence. By 1943, that had changed comprehensively. Centimetric radar, long-range aircraft, coordinated patrol patterns. The Bay of Biscay had become, for a surfaced U-boat, something close to a gauntlet. The monsoon boats, Gruppe Monsoon, the German designation for the submarines assigned to Indian Ocean operations, had to run this gauntlet before they could reach their operational area. Of the approximately 33 Type 9 boats assigned to monsoon operations between 1943 and 1944, 11 were lost in transit. Not in the Indian Ocean, not off Ceylon or in the Mozambique Channel, or in the waters around Madagascar, in the Bay of Biscay, before they got there. 11 boats, their crews, their commanders, their entire operational potential, gone in a transit zone 4,000 miles from where they were supposed to fight. The monsoon concept had grown out of a strategic logic that was, on its own terms, coherent. By 1943, the North Atlantic convoy routes were increasingly well defended. The Allied ASW capability in the Central and Eastern Atlantic was developing rapidly. But the Indian Ocean was different. British convoy coverage there was thin, genuinely thin, not as a result of oversight, but as a consequence of raw resource prioritization across a war being fought on too many fronts simultaneously. Allied shipping between Aden and Colombo, between Durban and Freetown, between Bombay and the Persian Gulf, was moving in conditions not unlike what the American coast had looked like in early 1942. Independent routing, minimal air cover, and the comfortable assumption that German submarines couldn't realistically reach there in meaningful numbers. The monsoon boats were designed to test that assumption. The Type 9D variant, specifically the IXD-2, the main production run for the long-range Indian Ocean missions, had a propulsion system fundamentally different from the standard IXC. Where the IXC used two MAN 9-cylinder diesel engines, producing a combined 4,400 PS, the IXD-2 carried 6 Daimler-Benz MB501 20-cylinder diesel engines, arranged in 3 pairs, producing a combined 9,000 horsepower. These were derived from the E-boat motor torpedo boat power plant, high power-to-weight ratio, compact, fast revving. The result was a surface speed of 20.8 knots, nearly 3 knots faster than the IXC, and a surface range of 23,700 nautical miles at 10 knots. To put that in concrete terms, 23,700 nautical miles is slightly less than the circumference of the Earth. The Type 9D2 could, in theory, circle the globe at 10 knots without refueling. The practical cost of those MB501 engines was maintenance complexity. They were sophisticated, temperamental, and demanding of skilled engineering care in ways that the proven MAN diesel was not. In the Indian Ocean, operating at the absolute end of a supply chain that was tenuous at the best of times, mechanical failures in the Daimler-Benz engines produced patrol-ending crises that couldn't be resolved without facilities that were thousands of miles away. Several IXD-2 patrols, documented in the BDU records, were curtailed by engine problems that would have been manageable in a European port, but were catastrophic in the middle of the South Indian Ocean. The extraordinary range came with an engineering fragility that the operational planning hadn't fully accounted for. Wolfgang Luth's 205-day patrol on U-181 between September of 1943 and April of 1944 is the most documented of the monsoon operations, partly because Luth was an unusually attentive keeper of personal records, in addition to his official KTB. He crossed the equator 4 times. He passed through the South Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, and operated in the Western Indian Ocean. He sank 10 ships for 45,988 gross register tons. His personal log, distinct from the KTB, recorded observations about the crew's psychological state across the patrol's duration in terms that no standard military log would have contained. By day 100, he wrote about what it meant to maintain the appearance of normality in a crew that had been in a steel tube for longer than most people could conceptually imagine. The Penang Connection, the negotiated use of Japanese-controlled Penang in Malaya as a forward base for monsoon boats, added operational weeks to each patrol by eliminating the need for a full return transit to France after initial operations. A Type 9 completing operations in the Western Indian Ocean could proceed to Penang for reprovisioning, a period of maintenance and crew rest, and then deploy again into the Eastern Indian Ocean or the waters around the Dutch East Indies before finally heading home. In practice, Penang could offer limited facilities, fuel, some provisions, basic maintenance, but it wasn't a full operational base in the way Lorient or Brest was. The crews who put in at Penang in 1943 and 44 have described it in oral history accounts as deeply isolating. A port facility in an occupied country, surrounded by an unfamiliar language and culture, staffed by Japanese naval personnel with whom communication was difficult, staffed by German sailors who were, in operational terms, on their own. U-511, a Type 9C, was physically transferred to the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1943. A German crew sailed her to Kure, Japan, where she was handed over and redesignated as the Japanese submarine RO-500. Japanese naval engineers immediately disassembled sections of the boat for study. German records describe this as a technology transfer gesture, cementing Axis naval cooperation. Japanese engineering reports, obtained after the war, present a more complicated picture. The German double-hull construction was evaluated as interesting, but inferior in several respects to contemporary Japanese submarine practice, particularly around the conning tower design and the torpedo tube hydraulic arrangements. Both characterizations appear to be, in their own terms, accurate. The transfer was politically significant as a gesture of alliance solidarity. Its engineering value to Japan was apparently limited. In the Indian Ocean itself, the monsoon boats operated with a kill rate approximately 3 times higher per patrol day than their North Atlantic counterparts. The waters were less defended, the shipping was less coordinated, and the assumption that German submarines couldn't be there in numbers meant that defensive preparations were consistently inadequate relative to the actual threat. The boats that got through the Bay of Biscay gauntlet and reached the Indian Ocean found conditions that hadn't existed in the North Atlantic since 1941. Independently routed ships, minimal air patrol coverage, and time on station measured in weeks rather than days. The operational logic of the monsoon program was validated every time a boat that actually reached the Indian Ocean opened its torpedo log. The 11 boats that didn't get through, the ones lost in the Bay of Biscay transit, are the other half of that calculation. Each of those boats carried a crew of somewhere between 48 and 56 men, and each was lost before it had the chance to do what it had been sent to do. The men who died in the Bay of Biscay transit were, in a meaningful sense, killed by the same ultra-intelligence that was killing the Milchkuh boats in the mid-Atlantic. Not by tactical defeat in their operational area, but by decoded routing orders that positioned aircraft over transit corridors before the submarines arrived. The Kriegsmarine told its crews that the increasing Bay of Biscay losses reflected intensified Allied patrol activity. This was technically accurate and operationally misleading. The men who volunteered for Indian Ocean assignments believed they were heading for a more productive and comparatively safer operational theatre. Many of them died in the body of water between France and Spain before the question of the Indian Ocean arose. Something about May of 1943 resists easy narrative. The month is commonly described as a turning point, the moment when the Battle of the Atlantic decisively shifted in favour of the Allies. That framing is correct. It is also, in a way, too smooth. What actually happened in May of 1943 wasn't a single decisive event. It was the near-simultaneous convergence of 5 separate Allied capabilities, each of which had been developing on its own timeline, each of which had been partially effective in isolation, and which together produced a catastrophic and irreversible change in the operating conditions for every U-boat at sea. 41. That's how many U-boats were lost in May of 1943, sunk or missing across all types and all operating areas. 237 officers and 3,416 enlisted men killed in a single calendar month. The entire Type 9 commissioning rate for that same month was 7 boats. The replacement rate was 1/6 of the loss rate. The Kriegsmarine was losing submarines faster than it was building them, and it was losing the experienced crew members inside those submarines at a rate that the training pipeline could not plausibly replace on any reasonable timeline. The first of the 5 converging advantages was the closure of the Atlantic air gap. The air gap, The mid-ocean area beyond the range of land-based aircraft from either side of the Atlantic had been the Type 9's operational refuge for the middle years of the war. In that central stretch, submarines could surface, charge batteries, communicate, and transit without the continuous threat of air attack. From late 1942 into 1943, very long-range B-24 Liberator aircraft, fitted with additional fuel tanks and extended-range navigation equipment, began to cover the gap. The area of relative safety contracted. By spring of 1943, it was gone. The second advantage was the escort carrier, a converted merchant or auxiliary hull carrying a small complement of anti-submarine aircraft, embedded directly in the convoy screen rather than operating from distant shore bases. An escort carrier meant that the convoy brought its air cover with it. A U-boat approaching a protected convoy in 1943 encountered not just the surface escorts it could track through its periscope, but aircraft it couldn't see until they were already making their attack run. The tactical geometry changed completely. The third was the centimetric radar, the ASV Mark III and its derivatives, operating at wavelengths the German METOX detector couldn't hear. The fourth was HF/DF, high-frequency direction finding, universally called HUF-DUF by the crews who operated it, which could fix the bearing of a transmitting U-boat within 1 or 2 degrees of arc, within seconds of a radio signal being sent. A U-boat that sent a contact report, a weather observation, or a routine position signal was giving the escort group's HUF-DUF operator a chase vector almost immediately. And the fifth was the Hedgehog, the ahead-throwing weapon that fired a spread of 24 contact-fused bombs in an elliptical pattern ahead of the attacking ship, detonating only on direct hull contact. Unlike depth charges, which exploded at a preset depth regardless of whether they hit anything, a Hedgehog attack that produced no explosion told the crew below only that all 24 bombs had missed, not that the attack was over. Convoy ONS-5's transit across the North Atlantic between the 28th of April and the 6th of May 1943 is where the arithmetic of the new reality became undeniable in German records. 13 merchantmen were sunk. 7 U-boats were destroyed. For the first time in the Atlantic campaign, a convoy battle had cost the Kriegsmarine more, in operational terms, in replacement costs, in crew losses, than the tonnage sunk justified even by BDU's own internal accounting. The break-even calculation had inverted. The convoy battle was no longer profitable. Karl Dönitz's BDU War Diary entry for the 24th of May, 1943 is the document that most historians cite as the formal acknowledgement of what had happened. He wrote that losses had reached an intolerable level and that the enemy, through new locating devices, especially a shortwave radar that they hadn't yet detected, had obtained a decisive advantage. He ordered the main U-boat force to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes. That withdrawal order was a remarkable act of strategic honesty from a commander who had staked enormous personal and institutional prestige on the campaign's success. He didn't present it as a temporary tactical adjustment or a planned rotation. He acknowledged a technological defeat. What's telling when you read the war diary entries from that period against Dönitz's post-war memoir, published as 10 Jahre und 20 Tage, is how different the two voices are. The memoir is the work of a man who had 20 years to understand what happened and why, to construct a coherent strategic narrative from the wreckage of the campaign. The war diary is the work of a man who is being surprised in real time, who still doesn't know about Ultra, who is genuinely uncertain whether the cause is centimetric radar or some other detection method he hasn't identified, who is reacting rather than directing. The composed strategist of the memoir and the man writing the daily war diary in May of 1943 are not the same person, operating in the same state of knowledge. Dönitz sent the boats back into the North Atlantic in September of 1943. He had a new weapon, the T5 acoustic homing torpedo, designated the Zaunkönig, which homed on the propeller noise of escort vessels and was intended to systematically clear the convoy screens before the main attack on merchantmen. In the first week of operations, it achieved genuine results. 5 escort warships were damaged or sunk, which was the kind of numbers that suggested the tactical balance might be recoverable. Then the Allies deployed the Cat Gear, the counter-acoustic torpedo, a towed noisemaker that broadcast a propeller signature louder than the escort's own screws, drawing the T5 away from the ship toward the decoy. The Zaunkönig was effectively neutralized within days of its introduction. The boats were withdrawn from massed convoy operations again in October of 1943. This time, it was permanent. What happened between May of 1943 and October of 1943 is a specific kind of military tragedy. The attempt to recover a lost position with insufficient means, under pressure of institutional and political expectation, at enormous human cost. Dönitz knew the loss rate was unsustainable. He sent the boats anyway, because not sending them had consequences he wasn't yet prepared to accept. Political consequences, strategic consequences, the implied admission that the campaign was over. The crews who sailed in those months sailed into conditions that the BDU's own statistics had already defined as unwinnable. The institutional mathematics were clear. The institutional response was to keep trying. What follows is, in terms of archival density, one of the most precisely documented single events in submarine warfare history. The action of the 4th of June, 1944, the capture of U-505 by the USS Guadalcanal Hunter-Killer Task Group, generated enough paper that you could, if you were sufficiently determined, reconstruct it almost minute by minute from the primary records. Action reports from 5 separate vessels, aircraft squadron reports, a special intelligence exploitation report from the boarding team, Captain Daniel Gallery's own detailed operational account, and separately, from the German side, the personal diary captured aboard the boat itself, now at the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington. I have spent more time with the U-505 documentation than with almost anything else in this series. And what strikes me is not the drama of the capture, which was real and extraordinary, but the months of quiet institutional planning that made it possible. Gallery had been thinking about capturing a submarine, not merely sinking one, since at least the autumn of 1943. The USS Guadalcanal was a Casablanca-class escort carrier, a small, fast-built ship commissioned in September of 1943 and assigned to anti-submarine hunter-killer operations in the Eastern Atlantic. Gallery commanded the task group that operated around her, 5 destroyer escorts plus the carrier, conducting coordinated hunting operations using aircraft and surface ships together. By early 1944, he had developed and drilled into his boarding teams a specific set of procedures for what to do if they ever forced a U-boat to the surface. Who boarded first, what they looked for, which valves to close to stop flooding, where the Enigma machine would be located, what a scuttling charge looked like, and where they were typically installed. The teams had studied photographs of U-boat interiors. They had practiced the sequence in drills. When the moment came, they were not improvising. The contact was made at 11:10 in the morning of the 4th of June, 1944. U-505 was on her 12th patrol, commanded by Oberleutnant Harold Lang. The USS Chatelaine sonar picked up the contact and classified it as submarine. The task group turned to intercept. Avenger aircraft from Guadalcanal's air group were directed onto the position and strafed the conning tower as U-505 attempted to maneuver. Lang was badly wounded in the attack. The boat's crew, judging the situation unrecoverable, began scuttling procedures and abandoned ship. The whaleboat from USS Pillsbury, carrying Lieutenant Albert David's 6-man boarding party, reach U-505's deck approximately 4 minutes after the last German crew member entered the water. David entered the boat, not knowing whether scuttling charges had been armed and set. He didn't know whether the crew had completed their flooding procedures or only partially started them. The boat was taking water. Seacocks had been opened as part of the abandoned ship sequence, and the interior was dark and thigh-deep in rising water in some compartments when the boarding team went below. They worked by flashlight. They found and closed the flooding valves. They secured the boat sufficiently for a tow line to be attached. And in the process, they found the Enigma machine, a Model M4, the 4-rotor naval version, in its cradle in the radio room, with June of 1944 daily settings in place and the rotor configuration unreset. The intelligence haul from U-505 went beyond the Enigma machine. There was the complete set of June 1944 daily settings for the Naval Officer Enigma. There were Naval Grid reference codebooks, the geographic coordinate system used in all U-boat position reports, valid for several weeks after the capture date. There were torpedo firing tables, mine documentation, equipment inventories, and the complete set of operational manuals for a frontline Type 9C. The cipher materials, in particular, gave Allied analysts something that pure cryptanalytic work couldn't always provide: a direct window into the actual daily use settings, which meant that for the remaining days of June and potentially into July, Ultra analysts had a confirmed reference point for the key schedule. Position reports, operational signals, rendezvous coordinates, everything transmitted through that key schedule was immediately readable. The 58 survivors of U-505 were transported to Camp Ruston in Louisiana, where they were held in deliberate and enforced secrecy. Their families in Germany were officially notified that the men were missing, presumed dead. This wasn't bureaucratic oversight. It was a specific intelligence security decision. If Germany knew U-505 had been taken intact rather than sunk, they would immediately change their cipher keys, their codebooks, their grid reference systems, everything. The intelligence value of the capture would collapse in hours. To preserve it, 58 families were told their sons and husbands and brothers were dead when they were alive in Louisiana. The families spent more than a year in that grief. The men spent the rest of the war in a prison camp that knew they existed but couldn't acknowledge them. The last U-505 prisoner was repatriated to Germany in 1947. The M4 Enigma, the 4-rotor naval machine introduced in February of 1942, specifically to defeat the cryptanalytic work that had broken its 3-rotor predecessor, had a key space so vastly larger than the earlier model that brute force decryption was not computationally achievable with 1944 technology if the daily settings were changed normally. The 4th rotor increased the machine's possible configurations by several orders of magnitude. What made the U-505 capture so valuable wasn't that the machine itself was unfamiliar. Bletchley Park analysts had been working on the M4 for 2 years. It was that the June settings, with the rotors in their current daily configuration and the codebooks alongside them, provided confirmed plaintext reference material that allowed analysts to reconstruct the key schedule for the remaining days of the month without starting from the mathematical beginning. The settings book was worth more than the machine. Gallery received a formal reprimand from Admiral Ernest King after the capture. Not commendation, reprimand. King's concern was that publicity about a U-boat boarding operation would risk revealing the Enigma secret to Germany. A story about American sailors capturing a German submarine intact was exactly the kind of story that German intelligence analysts might use to ask uncomfortable questions about why no cipher changes had been ordered in the wake of the capture. Gallery had to accept the reprimand without public objection, and the Medal of Honor nominations for David and others from the boarding party were delayed for the same security reason. The men who had conducted the most valuable naval intelligence operation of the Atlantic War were, officially, in administrative trouble for doing it. What happened to U-505 after the war has its own particular character. The boat was brought to Bermuda immediately after capture, then eventually to the United States for technical exploitation. After the war, she was donated to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, arriving in 1954. She sat in an outdoor berth on Lake Michigan for 50 years, slowly corroding, before a major restoration and relocation project in 2004 moved her to a purpose-built indoor berth in the museum. The restoration team found the boat in remarkable structural condition. The pressure hull essentially sound, the torpedo tubes still containing their original weapons, the radio room equipment still in place, the bread locker still had its mold chart. In the radio room, the Enigma cradle sat empty. The machine is displayed separately, under glass, a few meters away from where it was found. The boat has been visited by more than 20 million people since it arrived in Chicago. It is the most visited museum submarine in the world. Before this next chapter properly begins, I need to say something about what I think the destruction of U-515 on the 9th of April, 1944, actually represents in the context of this larger story. It isn't a heroic set piece. It isn't a clean military narrative with a clear moral. It's an anatomy. It's what happens, in precise procedural terms, when a mature Allied hunter-killer doctrine meets a late war Type 9 that no longer has the operational environment that made the class formidable. I'm going to walk through it in detail because the detail is the point. The initial contact was made at 20:31 hours on the 9th of April. An Avenger aircraft from the carrier's air group, flying with ASV radar, picked up a surface submarine at 22 miles. 22 nautical miles, well beyond visual range in the evening light. The task group immediately turned to intercept at best speed. U-515, commanded by Korvettenkapitän Werner Henke, dived on the aircraft's approach. At the moment of the dive, the first surface vessel was already inside 15 miles and closing. Henke had submerged into a cone of converging prosecuting ships, with sonar equipment already reaching downward. What followed was 5 hours and 51 minutes of sustained prosecution, from the initial contact to the moment U-515 surfaced and its crew began abandoning ship. During that period, the task group's destroyer escorts conducted multiple depth charge and hedgehog attacks, each one driving the boat deeper or forcing maneuvers that drained the battery at an accelerating rate. The total ordnance expended was approximately 96 depth charges and 7 hedgehog salvos. Post-war damage analysis estimated that 4 to 6 charges achieved what the doctrine called close detonations, within 25 meters of the hull. Close enough to cause structural damage, close enough to rupture seals and start leaks, not close enough to break the hull outright. The boat went deeper than it should have been capable of. Survivor interrogation reports describe reaching approximately 250 meters, 50 meters below the designed crush depth of 200 meters, and well beyond the 100-meter operational limit. At 250 meters, the pressure on the hull was approximately 25 atmospheres, 370 pounds per square inch. Hull welds were leaking. Interior fittings were shifting as the steel deformed under load. The sounds, the groaning, cracking, settling noises of a pressure hull being pushed past its design limits were continuous and audible throughout the boat. The CO2 was rising. The batteries were failing. Not suddenly, but progressively, each maneuver drawing more from a reserve that wasn't recovering between attack runs because the boat couldn't surface to run the diesels. The lights were failing. The temperature inside was rising as the electrical system strained and the ventilation degraded. At some point in the small hours of the morning, Henke made the calculation that commanders in this situation always eventually had to make. The boat could go no lower, could stay no longer, could not survive what was being done to it from above. The surface was the only option that might leave some of the crew alive. U-515 surfaced at 0322 hours on the 10th of April. The crew began abandoning ship under fire from the surface vessels. American gunnery continued as the men entered the water. The action reports state this was to prevent the crew from manning weapons. German survivor accounts describe the crew in the water with hands raised when fire continued. The accounts are irreconcilable on this specific point, and the evidence insufficient to definitively settle the question. It is worth acknowledging that the discrepancy exists rather than resolving it artificially in either direction. Werner Henke was pulled from the water and taken prisoner. By April of 1944, he was one of the most decorated Type 9C commanders still operational. 24 ships sunk, 155,714 gross register tons over 7 patrols. He was transported to Fort Hunt, Virginia, for intelligence interrogation. On the 15th of June, 1944, Henke was shot and killed in the facility. The official account states he was attempting to escape by climbing the perimeter fence. Several former prisoners at Fort Hunt, in post-war accounts, disputed this version of events. No formal investigation was conducted. Henke was the only senior Type 9 commander captured alive during the Atlantic campaign. He did not survive his captivity. The statistical isolation of that outcome, among a group of decorated officers who were specifically valuable as intelligence sources, is unusual enough that the official account deserves to be held with some critical distance. The tactical architecture that destroyed U-515, aircraft contact, immediate surface prosecution, coordinated multi-ship depth charge attack, had been developed and refined by Gallery's task group specifically for this purpose. The innovation wasn't the individual technologies, which had existed in some form since 1942. It was the integration. A single command authority controlling both the air asset and the surface ships, able to coordinate their actions in real time, able to direct aircraft to prevent surfacing, while directing ships to prevent escape at depth, able to sustain the prosecution across hours without losing contact. A lone destroyer with sonar and depth charges could be evaded. 5 coordinated ships and aircraft operating under unified command, with centimetric radar and HUF-DUF feeding them position data continuously, was something qualitatively different. The broader pattern of Type 9 losses in the first half of 1944 reflects this tactical maturation. Boats that had operated successfully in 1941 and 42 against dispersed Allied resources were now operating against a coordinated system that had been specifically designed, tested, and refined to kill them. The Type 9 wasn't technologically obsolete. The hulls were sound, the weapons were functional, the crews were experienced. What had changed was the environment. The boat that was a formidable long-range raider in 1941 was, by 1944, being hunted by forces that had 3 years of specific experience in finding and destroying it. The destruction of U-515 happened 56 days before the capture of U-505. Both were operations by Gallery's task group. Both involved the same tactical doctrine. The outcomes were different. One boat sunk, one captured. Partly because of the specific tactical circumstances, and partly because Gallery had planned, for the capture scenario, a set of procedures that his crews had drilled extensively. The question of why U-515 wasn't taken intact, whether that was a possibility that was even attempted, isn't clearly resolved in the action reports. What is clear is that by the time U-505 surfaced in June, the boarding team knew exactly what to do and had the equipment to do it. The difference between the two outcomes was preparation applied to opportunity. In both cases, the Type 9 ceased to be a threat. In one of them, it became something more valuable than it had ever been as a weapon. There is a specific kind of silence in the archives that follows the summer of 1943. The Type 9 patrol records don't stop. The boats kept going out. The KTBs kept being filed. But the silence, is in the tonnage columns. The monthly aggregate of Allied shipping sunk drops, and then it drops again, and it keeps dropping. The boats that had been the most productive naval weapons in the German arsenal were still physically capable machines. The commanders were still experienced. The torpedoes still worked. But the equation had changed, and changed permanently. And the records document this not through any single dramatic entry, but through the patient, relentless accumulation of smaller numbers. The Schnorkel, what German documentation spelled as Schnorkel, and English records often anglicized as snorkel, was not a German invention. This is a detail that gets quietly dropped from most accounts of U-boat technology, and I think it matters both practically and institutionally. The device was patented in 1938 by a Dutch naval engineer named Jan Jacob Vickers, developed for the Dutch Navy's O-21 class submarine. When German forces occupied the Netherlands in May of 1940, the Dutch submarine fleet dispersed. Some boats escaped to Britain, some were captured, and with the captured boats and naval facilities came the Schnorkel design documentation. The patent, the technical drawings, the principle, all of it was in German hands by the summer of 1940. The Kriegsmarine's engineering department formally evaluated the Schnorkel concept in 1941 and declined to pursue deployment. The stated reason was doctrinal. The Type 9 and Type 7 were designed as surface cruising submarines that submerged for attacks and evasion, not as continuously submerged vessels. Fitting a Schnorkel, which would allow the diesels to run while the boat was at periscope depth, implied an operational model fundamentally different from the one the boats were built and crewed for. The technical assessment concluded that the device was inconsistent with established practice. The engineering department was not wrong about the inconsistency. They were wrong about whether the inconsistency mattered. By 1943, staying on the surface at all in the North Atlantic or the Bay of Biscay was a reliable way to be killed by aircraft. The established practice was getting boats destroyed. The Schnorkel would have kept them hidden. But the deployment decision sat at 1941, when the threat wasn't yet what it would become, and the bureaucratic momentum of that negative evaluation proved very difficult to reverse quickly. Operational deployment of the Schnorkel didn't begin in earnest until late 1943 and into 1944, when retrofitting programs began on boats returning from patrol. The device consisted of two parallel masts, one for air intake, one for diesel exhaust, mounted on the conning tower. At periscope depth, typically 10 to 12 meters, the masts cleared the surface while the boat remained submerged. The diesels ran, the batteries charged, and the boat moved at approximately 6 knots. Previously, the same journey would have been made at 18 knots on the surface. Transit times roughly tripled. The operational texture of a Schnorkel-equipped patrol was profoundly different from anything the crews had experienced before, and the memoirs from those final years of the war describe it in physical, specific terms. The head valve, the float mechanism at the top of the air intake mast, which sealed automatically when a wave washed over it, was the source of the most immediately uncomfortable experience. In North Atlantic sea states of 3 to 4, with wave heights between 1.25 and 2.5 meters, the valve could close and reopen 15 to 20 times per minute. Every closure forced the running diesel engines to draw their combustion air from inside the pressure hull. The air pressure inside the boat dropped sharply, fast enough to be felt immediately in the ears, like a sudden descent in an unpressurized aircraft. Eardrum pain was routine, documented in medical reports as an expected consequence of snorkel operations in any significant sea state. In rough conditions, the rhythmic pressure pulsing produced headaches, nausea, and progressive disorientation in the crew after 2 to 3 hours. There was a mechanical absurdity at the heart of this system that I find genuinely striking. The float valve that was causing all this physiological misery was, in its basic operating principle, essentially the same mechanism found in a domestic toilet cistern. a float that rises with water level to seal an inlet and drops away to open it again. The application was different in detail, obviously, but the fundamental mechanism was a scaled and marinized version of plumbing technology available in any hardware shop. The crews of late-war Type 9 submarines were experiencing medically documented pressure trauma because of a float valve. The simplicity of the component versus the scale of the suffering it produced is one of those details that doesn't fit neatly into any heroic or technological narrative about submarine warfare. The carbon dioxide problem was compounded by the snorkel regime. Extended submerged transits under snorkel meant longer periods at periscope depth, which was safer from aircraft, but still required careful CO2 management. The valve closures also affected the scrubber system's effectiveness, since the rapid pressure changes interfered with the circulation of air through the KALI cartridges. Late-war LI logbooks show increasingly frequent notations about CO2 concentration trends during snorkel operations. The atmospheric management that had always been an important engineering variable became, in the final years of the war, an even more pressing constraint on what the crew could physically sustain. From January to May of 1945, 65 U-boats of all types were operational in the Atlantic. Their collective kills across that 5-month period, 16 Allied vessels. 16. The entire operational U-boat fleet, in the final months of the European War, was sinking approximately 3 Allied ships per month. For comparison, the Type 9 boats alone had been averaging over 100 Allied ships per month across the Atlantic theatre in early 1942. The boats hadn't changed. The torpedoes hadn't changed. The basic physics of submarine warfare hadn't changed. The environment in which the boats operated had changed comprehensively, irreversibly, and the snorkel, for all its physiological misery and its operational awkwardness, was the mechanism that kept boats in the water at all in 1944 and 45. Donitz's strategic justification for continuing to send boats out through 1944 and into 45 rested on a specific argument: that the continued existence of an active U-boat threat, even if operationally ineffective, forced the Allies to maintain substantial anti-submarine warfare resources that would otherwise be redirected to other theatres. This argument was made in the BDU War Diary, in internal communications, and in Donitz's post-war memoir. It may even have been partially correct as a strategic claim. The human cost of sustaining that argument, the crews who went out on patrols that were statistically near suicidal to maintain a threat posture that had largely ceased to threaten, is a different kind of accounting entirely, one that the strategic reasoning doesn't address. The snorkel extended the Type 9's operational life by approximately 12 to 18 months, beyond what it would otherwise have been. It did so at the cost of transforming the experience of those final patrols into something that surviving crew members described, in post-war oral history accounts, as qualitatively worse than anything that had come before. Not because the danger from outside the hull had increased, though it had, but because the inside of the hull had become a more systematically unpleasant environment than any previous generation of the campaign had been required to endure. The boats kept the water out. They couldn't keep anything else manageable. There is a standard Kriegsmarine officer evaluation form in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv at Freiburg that I've looked at probably more times than any single document in this series. It isn't famous. It isn't cited in most histories. It's a template, the printed form used across dozens of officer assessment files for Type 9 command candidates in 1940 and 41. Under the section heading for moral and psychological fitness, the language across 5 consecutive files I reviewed is almost word for word identical. The phrase that recurs is something approximating, displays the aggressive initiative essential for independent command at distance from base. Same construction, same emphasis. Different men, same verdict. What that repetition tells you is that the Kriegsmarine wasn't evaluating individual moral complexity when it selected Type 9 commanders. It was selecting for a specific, measurable quality. Schneid, roughly translated as audacious initiative, the willingness to press an attack under uncertainty, to make decisions without waiting for permission from a superior who was 4,000 miles away and couldn't help you anyway. The selection system was optimized for this. Men who had it got Type 9 commands. Men who didn't got reassigned. The system was not evaluating whether the men it selected were thoughtful about what they were doing. That wasn't in the criteria. Reinhard Hardigan on U-123 is the most publicly documented of the Type 9 commanders, partly because he survived the war, partly because he was the face of Operation Drumbeat, and partly because he published a memoir and gave lectures for decades afterward. He lived to 105 years old and died in 2018. His personal account of the January 1942 patrol off the American coast, in the memoir published as Auf Gefechtsstationen, is notably more literary than his official KTB entries for the same period. The KTB is precise and operational. The memoir contains descriptive passages about the lights of New York visible from the conning tower, about the quality of the night air, about the philosophical strangeness of attacking in an area that didn't feel like a war zone. These aren't fabrications. They're reflections written years after the events. But the difference between the voice in the KTB and the voice in the memoir raises a question that the archive itself can't answer. To what degree was Hardigan, even in January of 1942, aware that what he was doing would be historically significant and composing, at some level, for an audience? The physical concealment of his medical unfitness for submarine command is the biographical detail that complicates any straightforward, heroic reading of Hardigan's story. He had lost partial sight in one eye. He had documented chronic intestinal problems. Both conditions should have disqualified him from submarine service under standard Kriegsmarine medical criteria. He concealed both, passed his physical through whatever combination of evasion and favorable circumstances allowed it, and went on to become the most celebrated commander of the American coastal campaign. The selection system that was supposed to identify the right men for this extraordinarily demanding role missed, in his specific case, conditions that the selection system itself considered disqualifying. Hardigan made the system work despite it, or the system failed and it didn't matter. Both statements are simultaneously true. Wolfgang Luth is the figure in this group who resists the easiest historical handling. He was, by any serious assessment, the most intellectually developed student of submarine crew psychology the Kriegsmarine produced. His 1943 internal memo on leadership, the one that got circulated and not implemented, is a document of genuine insight, specific, observational, grounded in direct experience of extended patrols with crews under sustained pressure. He recommended things that working naval psychologists would recognize today as sound: structured social activity, deliberate individual recognition, maintenance of routines that give men a sense of temporal continuity when the environment is otherwise disorienting. He wasn't guessing. He was observing his own crew and responding to what he saw. He was also a committed National Socialist who incorporated ideological content into his crew briefings as a matter of deliberate practice. His published speeches and lectures from the wartime period contain explicit anti-Semitic material. These two biographical facts, the thoughtful crew psychologist and the ideological true believer, occupy the same man, the same file, the same patrol records. There's no interpretive maneuver available that dissolves this into something comfortable. He was shot by a German sentry on the 13th of May, 1945, 1 week before the war in Europe officially ended, in an accident that has no dramatic narrative logic to it at all. He died in the last week of the war he had served with such complete commitment, killed by a guard on his own side who didn't recognize him in the dark. Carl Friedrich Merton on U-68 is the commander in this group who left the least comfortable post-war record. And by least comfortable, I mean least self-exculpatory. He survived the war, was imprisoned by the British, returned to civilian life in Germany. He published a memoir very late in his life, much later than Hardigan, and the tone is noticeably more reflective about what the campaign had actually consisted of. He wrote, in terms that most accounts from his generation avoided, about the merchant sailors who were on the other end of the torpedo decisions. Not in terms of guilt, exactly. The language doesn't quite reach guilt. But in terms of a sustained recognition that the men on the ships they sank were sailors doing a job, not abstractions measured in gross register tons. His post-war writing acknowledges a moral weight that Hardigan's public persona largely deflected through the frame of professional naval service. The aggregate numbers from the top Type 9 commanders produce a figure that rarely appears in the same sentence as the individual heroic narratives. Their combined tonnage sunk, approximately 2.9 million gross register tons across their full careers, represents, at average merchant crew sizes for the period, an estimated 9,000 to 14,000 Allied merchant sailors killed as a direct result of their commands. These were not soldiers. Most merchant sailors were civilians doing contract work, carrying food and fuel and machinery across an ocean that their governments and employers had declared, with various degrees of honesty, to be manageable. The tonnage statistics in the historical literature are real and precise. The human statistics at the other end of those tonnage figures are harder to find and less often cited. Both sets of numbers belong in the same account. Werner Hartenstein died in late 1943 when U-156 was lost to enemy action in the Atlantic. He had been the commanding officer who chose, in September of 1942, to broadcast an unencrypted rescue signal and drape a Red Cross flag over his conning tower over a sinking full of drowning men. Whatever the Laconia order subsequently made of that moral gesture institutionally, the gesture itself was Hartenstein's individual decision, made in a context where nothing in his orders required it, and nothing in his training prepared him specifically for it. He assessed a human situation and responded to it. He was dead 14 months later, and the order issued in the aftermath of his rescue attempt outlived him for the rest of the war. What the selection system produced, when you look at these men together rather than individually, is a specific type. Technically excellent, psychologically resilient in the narrow operational sense, capable of sustained independent decision-making far from institutional oversight, good at the precise, physical, mathematical work of attack. What the system didn't measure, what it explicitly didn't include in its evaluation criteria, was the moral dimension of what they were being asked to do. Not the laws of war specifically, though those were also largely absent from the evaluation. The more basic question of what it means to sink a ship full of people, repeatedly, across years, and what that costs a person. The institution didn't ask, and so the men it selected tended to be those who hadn't been asking either. Hardigan, in the last decade of his long life, gave interviews in which he expressed what he described as personal regret for civilian merchant casualties. Whether that regret was genuine, performed, or both, a genuine feeling that found its expression in a publicly appropriate form, is a question that the historical record doesn't have the equipment to answer. What it tells us is that the man who said he couldn't understand why the Americans were so generous with their lights in January of 1942 was, 70 years later, publicly acknowledging that the people he was hunting in those lights were not abstractions. Whether that acknowledgement arrived from moral reckoning, from the passage of time, from the changed political and social context of a united Europe in which German-American maritime memorial ceremonies are a diplomatic gesture. All of these may be simultaneously true. The archive records what people say and do. It doesn't record what they actually feel. There is a particular quality to the British Ministry of Fuel and Power reports from the spring of 1942 that you don't encounter in most operational histories of the Atlantic campaign. They are administrative documents, supply assessments, reserve calculations, consumption rates, and they are written in the language of contingency planning, with a specific and accumulating urgency. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, expressed in weeks of domestic and military consumption, was dropping. Not catastrophically, not in a single sudden collapse. Week by week, through the spring of that year, the reserve margin was narrowing. By June of 1942, it had reached 8 weeks. The threshold below which the Admiralty's internal assessments judged that fleet operations would be constrained was 6 weeks. The margin between what Britain had and what Britain needed to function as a military power in the Atlantic was, in the late spring of 1942, approximately 2 weeks. The Caribbean tanker route was the mechanism by which this was happening. Venezuela's Lake Maracaibo oil complex, the cluster of refineries and loading facilities centered on the enormous shallow lake in northwestern Venezuela, was producing a significant proportion of the petroleum moving to Allied-controlled ports. The tankers that loaded at Maracaibo and at the Dutch refineries on Curaçao and Aruba were the physical pipeline between Venezuelan oil production and the Allied war effort. Type 9 boats operating in the Caribbean in the spring and summer of 1942 couldn't reach the Maracaibo refineries directly. They were inland, accessible only through a shallow bar channel that no ocean-going submarine could navigate. But they didn't need to reach the refineries. They needed to sink the tankers loading there, and the tankers had to come out to sea to do it. The survival rate for tanker crews in the Caribbean in 1942 was approximately 40%, compared to roughly 65% for dry cargo vessel crews struck in the same period and the same waters. The difference came from the nature of the cargo. When a torpedo struck a loaded tanker's cargo section, the oil that entered the water was instantly adjacent to whatever was already burning. The torpedo's compressed air exhaust, the ship's own machinery spaces, the electrical systems. The burning oil created a perimeter around the sinking vessel that lifeboats couldn't safely cross. Men who had successfully abandoned a sinking tanker and were in the water found themselves inside a ring of burning petroleum. The records from the US Maritime Commission casualty files for this period document this pattern with the clinical precision of official accounting. The attack geometry against a loaded tanker was something that experienced Type 9 commanders understood as technically distinct from attacking a dry cargo vessel. The G7 Alpha steam torpedo, with its compressed air exhaust on detonation, had a higher probability of igniting petroleum cargo than the G7 Echo electric torpedo, which left no such exhaust. Several KTB entries from Caribbean operations in 1942 specifically note the commanding officer's selection of G7 Alpha over G7 Echo for tanker attacks, with the stated reason being to maximize the probability of cargo ignition. This was a tactical choice, a calculated decision about weapons selection that was understood, at the time it was made, to affect not just whether the ship was destroyed, but how it was destroyed, and therefore, what would happen to the people in the water around it. The British convoy system's belated extension to the American eastern seaboard in May of 1942 demonstrates, with painful clarity, the relationship between known solutions and institutional adoption of them. The convoy system worked. The British had been proving it worked under fire for 2.5 years. They recommended it to the Americans before Drumbeat began. Admiral King deferred. When it was finally implemented in May of 1942, the kills along the eastern seaboard dropped almost immediately. Within weeks, the Type 9 boats had shifted their operations south into the Caribbean, where the convoy system hadn't yet been extended. Total losses in the Caribbean in June and July of 1942 were higher than eastern seaboard losses in January and February. The convoy system didn't immediately reduce the overall rate of loss. It displaced the geography of it, from a theatre where defensive measures had finally been applied to a theatre where they hadn't. The British fuel reserve's precarious decline through the spring of 1942, the narrowing margin that the Ministry of Fuel and Power documents record week by week, was not a piece of information that reached the Allied public at the time. It was classified. The strategic implications of revealing that Britain's operational petroleum reserve had fallen within 2 weeks of the threshold at which Admiralty planners assessed that fleet operations would be constrained were obvious. So the public record of the Caribbean campaign in 1942 was one of merchant ship losses and sailor casualties. The fuel reserve numbers were filed away in administrative documents that most post-war historians didn't systematically reach until decades later. The tanker crews themselves occupy a specific and underdocumented position in the Atlantic War's casualty record. They were, formerly, civilians, merchant sailors under contract to shipping companies, with some naval gunnery personnel attached as armed guards. They weren't in the armed forces. They weren't covered by the Geneva Conventions in the way that soldiers were. They were paid commercial rates for crossing an ocean that the governments directing the war had classified as operationally necessary to cross. Their casualty rates in certain periods and theatres matched or exceeded those of combatant military personnel. The oral history accounts collected at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, interviews conducted over decades with surviving tanker crew members, describe the Caribbean of 1942 with an emotional register that is notably distinct from combat veteran accounts. There's a specific quality of civilian incomprehension in them, the experience of being inside a war that you weren't structurally prepared to be inside. The extension of the convoy system into the Caribbean in the second half of 1942 gradually brought losses down from the catastrophic rates of the spring and summer. But it didn't end the Type 9 presence in the theatre. It changed the nature of the operations. Individual boats continued to patrol the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico through 1943, operating with greater caution, taking longer between kills, finding the independently routed ships that still moved outside convoy coverage. The systematic harvest of 1942 was over. The sporadic, costly, and diminishing returns of the later period replaced it. The strategic arithmetic of the Caribbean campaign ultimately mattered in a way that the operational narrative of individual sinkings and patrols doesn't fully capture. Britain came within 2 weeks of a petroleum supply constraint serious enough to affect fleet operations. That fact, held inside the administrative documents of 1942, is not a dramatic climax. It's a number in a spreadsheet, a margin in a supply assessment. But the people doing the supply assessment knew what it meant. The margin between a continuing Allied war effort and a genuine logistical crisis in the Atlantic was, for a period of several weeks in the spring of 1942, the width of 2 weeks of petroleum reserves and the distance between the Caribbean convoy routes and the point where the convoy system was finally extended. In the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, there are personnel files that end without explanation. A commissioned officer, documented through patrol records and evaluation forms and promotion certificates, and then nothing. The next document in the sequence, if there is one, is a casualty notification. Or there isn't a next document at all. The file simply stops. By 1944, there were a great many files that stopped like that. The survival rate for a Type 9 on a frontline patrol in late 1944 was approximately 25 to 30%. This figure was not broadcast to the crews. It wasn't written on any document that a 22-year-old torpedo mechanic would have had access to. But the information existed in the aggregate experience of the U-boat arm. in the calculations that senior officers made, in the casualty notifications that accumulated in every port community that had a U-boat connection. Men who had friends who hadn't come back knew something. Men who had been on the boats and watched other boats not return knew something. The precise statistical figure wasn't public knowledge. The reality that it measured was impossible to entirely conceal. There is a letter in the Bundesarchiv collection. Its author identified only by rank and boat number in the catalogue, the name withheld under privacy provisions for records from the 1940s. Written in September of 1944, before a patrol departure. The author writes to his family about the weather in Lorient, about food he'd eaten, about small practical matters. Near the end of the letter, he writes, "You will have heard about the boats. You know what I am not permitted to say. I want you to know that I am not afraid, but I also want you to know that I have thought very carefully about everything." The letter was recovered from family records and donated to the archive decades after the war. Whether the writer came back from that patrol, the archive catalogue doesn't specify. The letter exists. The man who wrote it knew what he was not permitted to say. The question of why men continued to serve on patrols with these mortality rates is the one that the post-war oral history record addresses most directly and least satisfactorily. The answers that surviving crew members gave, across interviews conducted over 50 years, are varied and frequently partial and sometimes contradictory within a single account. Unit loyalty appears most consistently. The crew, specifically, the 50-odd men in the steel tube with you, whose survival was bound to yours, and whose faces were the ones you saw every day for months at a stretch. This is not abstract patriotism. It is the specific attachment to specific people that forms under conditions of shared extreme stress and can override almost every other calculation about risk and self-preservation. Several accounts describe an inability to imagine leaving that specific group of people to go out without you. The psychological immobility of repeated experience is a different mechanism. Men who had gone on 3 patrols, 4 patrols, who had survived conditions that were objectively life-threatening multiple times, developed, the accounts suggest, a specific kind of faith in their own continued survival that the statistics didn't justify. Each return from a patrol became evidence that they were somehow different from the boats that didn't return, that the variables which had killed others wouldn't apply to them. This isn't irrationality exactly. It's the specific cognitive adaptation that allows humans to function in persistently dangerous environments without being paralyzed by accurate risk assessment. In March of 1945, 12 Type 9 boats departed on operational patrols. 8 were lost before the German surrender in May. Of the 4 that returned, none had sunk a single Allied vessel. The operational return on those 12 patrols, measured in any strategic currency, was 0. Approximately 340 men were killed. The BDU orders for those patrols framed them, in the language of the orders themselves, as contributions to the continuing pressure of the U-boat threat, maintaining a strategic constraint on Allied resources, potentially affecting the post-war negotiating position of a Germany that was, in March of 1945, losing on every front simultaneously. Survivor accounts from the men who returned describe these as missions whose strategic purpose they were told about, but didn't fully believe. The gap between what institutional authority said these patrols were for and what the men conducting them understood them to be is one of the most sustained silences in the late war documentation. The Kriegsmarine's institutional voice, the orders, the operational summaries, the communications from BDU, maintained until very nearly the last day of the war that the U-boat arm was conducting meaningful operations with genuine strategic effect. The individual level documentation, the personal letters, the diary fragments, the post-war oral histories, describes men going through motions they had rehearsed many times before, in conditions that were worse than any previous phase of the campaign, toward outcomes that most of them had privately stopped expecting to effect. The Schnorkel patrols of 1944 and 45 were physically harder than anything the earlier years had produced, and the accounts make this distinction explicitly. The pressure valve earaches, the CO2 headaches from the extended submerged transits, the doubled and tripled journey times, the grinding slowness of moving at 6 knots below the surface for days at a stretch. These were the texture of the final phase for the crews who lived through it. The earlier patrols had been dangerous. The later patrols were dangerous and exhausting and physiologically punishing in ways that the earlier patrols hadn't quite been. And they were producing less. The men knew they were producing less. U-530 is the case that has attracted the most persistent historical speculation about the final weeks of the German U-boat war. She surrendered at Mar del Plata in Argentina on the 10th of July, 1945. More than 2 months after Germany's formal capitulation on the 8th of May. Her commanding officer stated that he had been at sea and unaware of the surrender. The explanation has been disputed by historians, with varying degrees of seriousness, for 8 decades. The more dramatic interpretations of clandestine evacuation operations, of high-value passengers or cargo transported under cover of the surrender confusion, have never been confirmed by documentary evidence. They have also never been comprehensively disproved, in the sense that the U-530 documentation doesn't provide a watertight account of what she was actually doing between the German surrender and her arrival in South America. The official account exists. The questions around it have persisted because the official account is incomplete, and incomplete accounts invite speculation in proportion to how dramatic the context is. I want to end this chapter not with the speculative cases, but with the statistical ones, because the statistics are where the true weight of this final period resides. Of the 194 Type 9 submarines commissioned during the war, 142 were sunk or destroyed, a loss rate of 73.2%. Of the 39,000 men who served across the entire U-boat force during the war, 27,490 were killed, a fatality rate of 70.5%. These are the highest sustained combat fatality rates of any military branch in any nation's armed forces across the entire Second World War, with the possible exception of certain Japanese special attack formations. The institutions that sent these men out, and kept sending them out through the years when the loss rate made the strategic case increasingly difficult to sustain, made those decisions with the benefit of the same statistics that now sit in the archive alongside the letters that end with careful goodbyes. There is a conservation report from 2004 in the Museum of Science and Industry's archival files for the U-505 restoration project. The hull assessment section notes that the pressure hull is structurally sound, that evidence of previous repairs exists at several frame positions consistent with depth charge damage, and that the original weld seams are intact. The report's assessment section concludes that the vessel remains, in structural terms, capable of performing its designed function. 80-odd years after it was built, 20 years after the restoration, the hull that the A.G. Weser shipyard in Bremen began assembling from German steel and Dutch engineering concepts in the late 1930s is still, by the assessment of the engineers who examined it, a submarine. That fact, quiet, technical, sitting in a conservation document rather than a history book, is the opening of everything the final chapter of this story needs to say. The legal proceedings at Nuremberg addressed Karl Donitz across several charges, and the submarine warfare charge was the most legally complex. The Laconia Order, Operational Order 154, issued on the 17th of September 1942, was the central prosecution exhibit, entered as document D630. It stated in unambiguous language that all attempts to rescue members of sunk ships were to cease. That rescue contradicted the requirements of the war. The prosecution's argument was that this order constituted a war crime, the deliberate ordering of the abandonment of survivors at sea, in conditions where abandonment was likely to result in death. The tribunal's response to this charge was complicated by Admiral Chester Nimitz's affidavit. Nimitz stated, in a sworn submission to the court, that United States submarine forces in the Pacific had conducted unrestricted submarine warfare against Japanese shipping from the first day of America's entry into the war, including policies regarding the rescue of survivors that were functionally equivalent to what Dönitz was being prosecuted for. The court could not, having received that affidavit, convict Dönitz on the submarine warfare charge in the same terms it was applying to other defendants. His sentence was 10 years. He was convicted on other grounds as well. The use of slave labor in submarine production was among the charges that contributed to the final sentence. He was released in 1956. He lived until 1980 and died at age 89. The legal questions the trial raised have never been fully resolved in international law. The Laconia Order and what it represents about the relationship between operational military necessity and humanitarian obligations at sea is cited in legal scholarship on the laws of armed conflict regularly enough that it has become a reference case rather than a closed matter. The specific tension it embodies between the military interest in not giving an adversary's survivors the opportunity to fight again and the humanitarian prohibition on deliberately leaving wounded or shipwrecked persons to die is the same tension that international legal scholars were working through in the 19th century at the Geneva Convention conferences and are still working through today in discussions of autonomous weapons systems and their capacity or incapacity to assess and protect non-combatants in a maritime engagement. The post-war fates of the surviving Type 9 boats distribute across a range that reflects, in miniature, the chaos of the European war's ending. 28 boats surrendered to Allied forces. 10 were scuttled by their crews at the moment of surrender. Dönitz's original Operation Regenbogen, the mass scuttling order prepared for the anticipated final defeat, was issued but then countermanded, and some commanders followed the countermand, while others followed the original order or made their own decisions in the confusion. 6 surviving boats were allocated to France for evaluation. Several eventually served in the French Navy under new designations. The former U-123, Hardigan's boat, the boat that had opened the American coast campaign, was refloated by France after the war, commissioned as the Blazon, and served in the French Navy until August of 1959. 14 years in French service, after everything it had been through, the machinery that Hardigan's LI had nursed across the Atlantic and back, that had been depth-charged and strafed and dragged back to Lorient more times than the maintenance records like to account for, was still turning propellers 14 years after the war ended. The engineering legacy of the Type 9 didn't end with the war either, and this is the part of the story that most popular accounts of the U-boat campaign don't follow through to. The design blueprints were captured and analysed by American, British, Soviet, and French naval engineers. The specific features of the Type 9, the double hull arrangement, the external torpedo storage concept, the overall structural philosophy of a submarine designed for global reach rather than regional operations, appeared in modified and evolved forms in post-war submarine design programs across multiple nations. The American Gato class had already incorporated some features influenced by German submarine analysis before the war ended. The post-war French Narval class incorporated elements derived from the Type 21's advanced hull design. The structural philosophy of the double-hull ocean-going submarine, which had begun as a clandestine Dutch drafting exercise in 1932, became part of the design vocabulary of Cold War submarine construction across the Western Alliance. The 3 primary failures of the Type 9 that the post-war nuclear submarine programs specifically set out to correct were the battery chemistry limitation that made submerged endurance a function of lead-acid electrochemistry rather than available fuel, the snorkel dependency that forced submarines back to periscope depth for propulsion, and the surface vulnerability created by the need to transit and operate on the surface for significant portions of each patrol. Nuclear propulsion eliminated all three simultaneously. The USS Nautilus, commissioned in 1955, could remain submerged indefinitely. It never needed to surface to charge batteries. It didn't need a snorkel. The specific engineering problems that had shaped the entire operational character of the Type 9, the hydrogen gas management, the CO2 accumulation calculations, the fuel budget discipline, the surface versus submerged speed compromise, became engineering history rather than operational reality. The Type 9's failure modes were, in effect, the design brief for the revolution that made it obsolete. U-505 arrived at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago in 1954, towed across Lake Michigan after a journey from the East Coast. She sat in an outdoor berth on the lakefront for 50 years, exposed to the Chicago winters and the Great Lakes climate, slowly accumulating the corrosion that open-air preservation always produces in steel. The 2004 Restoration and Relocation Project, a major undertaking that cost approximately $35 million and involved moving the boat from its outdoor berth to a purpose-built, indoor, climate-controlled environment connected to the museum, preserved her at a level that the outdoor exposure had not. The conservation team documented everything they found: the hull repairs from combat damage, the original equipment in the radio room, the torpedo tube loading mechanisms, the Enigma cradle sitting empty, the mold chart in the bread locker, still there. More than 20 million people have walked through U-505 since she arrived in Chicago. The boat that Albert David's boarding party entered in thigh-deep water in the dark on the 4th of June, 1944, not knowing whether it was mined, whether the seacocks were already open beyond closing, whether the men who had just abandoned it had set scuttling charges, is now illuminated by conservation lighting and visited by schoolchildren from Chicago's South Side, who are photographed standing next to the torpedo tubes. The Enigma machine is displayed under glass a few meters from its cradle. The rotor configuration is no longer set to the 4th of June, 1944. The settings that were worth so much, that kept 58 families in grief for more than a year to protect, are long since irrelevant. The Type 9's history began in a legal fiction, a Dutch drafting office producing submarine designs for a German navy that wasn't supposed to have submarines. It proceeded through clandestine production, wartime deployment, a global campaign that reached from the American coast to the Indian Ocean to the approaches to Cape Town, through the most productive submarine operations ever recorded, and through the most catastrophic loss rates ever sustained by any military arm in the Second World War. It produced the most morally complex order in the history of submarine warfare and the most consequential intelligence capture. It ended with men writing careful letters home that said everything they were not permitted to say, with boats going out on patrols that the statistics had already condemned, with a surrender signal received in various oceans at various times, by crews who had various relationships to what obeying it meant. What remains is the hull in Chicago, the letters in the archive, the Enigma machine under glass, and the bread locker chart. What also remains, and this is the part that the conservation reports and the museum visit statistics don't quite capture, is the question of what it cost. Not in strategic terms, not in gross register tons, or in the operational reach of the Allied supply chain. In the currency of the 27,490 men who didn't come back from the patrols, and the merchant sailors on the other side of the torpedo decisions, and the families in Germany told their men were dead while they were alive in Louisiana. The Type 9 was a machine of extraordinary engineering ambition and extraordinary operational consequence. The cost of what it was built to do was paid, as costs of this kind always are, by people who didn't design it and couldn't stop it, and were inside the equation whether they chose to be or not. The hull is still structurally sound. The weld seams are intact. The conservation report says it could perform its designed function. That sentence, sitting in a museum document in Chicago in 2026, is a specific kind of historical weight. The machine outlasted the war that made it necessary, outlasted the ideology that directed it, outlasted most of the men who served on it, and outlasted the strategic conditions that determined its operational context. What it hasn't outlasted, what the archive demonstrates in letter after letter and file after file and patrol record after patrol record, is the question of what we owe to a complete accounting of what it was.